Arthur, remembered by history as Arthur Tudor, Prince of Wales, the first heir of the Tudor dynasty, lived a life so brief and yet so consequential that its echoes would reach across centuries and reshape the very soul of England itself. He was born to carry the weight of a kingdom that had only just found its footing, named after a legend before he had even drawn his first breath, shaped by his father's desperate need for permanence in a world still raw from war. He grew up in quiet, studious preparation, learning Latin and governance in the cold stone chambers of a border castle, understanding from the earliest age that he was not simply a boy. He was a promise. And then, at 15 years old, he stood in the grandest cathedral in England beside a princess who had crossed storms and mountains to reach him. And for one brief, luminous season, it seemed that everything his father had built was going to hold. But on a grey April morning in a Welsh castle, with spring barely stirring outside the windows, it was over. The promise dissolved, the dynasty tilted, and the world that followed was shaped entirely by his absence. Tonight, we follow that journey from the very beginning. Good evening, and welcome back to Sleepy Crown Reborn. If you've just subscribed, welcome to the family. And if you're returning to us again, welcome back home. It is a pleasure to have you here. Tonight, make yourself comfortable, lower the lights, and let the day gently slip away. Over the next few hours, we'll share the calm, complete story of Arthur Tudor, Prince of Wales, the eldest son of the first Tudor king, the boy raised from birth to rule in England still healing from decades of civil war, told slowly and with care to help guide you into sleep. We'll softly explore the full arc of his short life, from his symbolic birth in the ancient city of Winchester, through his years of solitary preparation at Ludlow Castle, his long negotiated marriage to Catherine of Aragon, and finally the quiet, devastating morning in April 1502, when everything changed, all while the gentle world of late 15th century England unfolds around him. And if you have a moment before you drift off, a gentle like and a quiet comment about which part of Arthur's story moves you most help keep these tales coming. To understand Arthur Tudor, we must first understand the world into which he arrived, a world that had been tearing itself apart for 30 years and that desperately, achingly needed someone to believe in. We must understand what it meant to be born a prince in late 15th century England, in a dynasty so new that the ink on its founding documents was barely dry. We must understand the father who named him, the mother who bore him, the country that greeted his arrival with bonfires and prayers of thanksgiving. And we must understand the weight, the extraordinary, almost crushing weight of expectation that was laid upon a child who had not yet opened his eyes. England in the summer of 1485 was a country exhausted by conflict. The Wars of the Roses, that long, bitter struggle between the House of Lancaster and the House of York for the right to sit upon the English throne, had burned through an entire generation of noblemen, kings, and heirs. Battles had been fought on English soil. Kings had been deposed, imprisoned, and killed. The country had lurched from one claimant to another, each succession more precarious than the last, each new reign carrying within it the seeds of its own undoing. The conflict had begun, in its formal sense, in the 1450s, when the weakness and mental instability of King Henry VI, a gentle, pious man wholly unsuited to the brutal demands of medieval kingship, had created a vacuum of power into which the ambitions of the great noble houses had rushed. The Duke of York, whose claim to the throne was arguably better than Henry VI's by strict genealogical reckoning, had first sought to control the king, then to replace him. The result was 3 decades of on-and-off civil war, punctuated by treaties that never held, alliances that shifted with every wind, and a succession of battles that had killed an extraordinary proportion of England's senior nobility and royal family. By 1485, the country had been ruled, in the space of 30 years, by a Lancastrian king, Henry VI, a Yorkist king, Edward IV, a brief Lancastrian restoration, Henry VI again, another Yorkist king, Edward III's return, Edward IV's son, the boy king Edward V, who had been placed in the Tower and never crowned, and finally Richard III, who had taken the throne from his nephew Edward V, in circumstances that remained even then deeply controversial. Every one of these transitions had been accompanied by violence. Everyone had produced new grievances, new exiles, new men with claims and grudges who waited for their chance. Into this world, in the summer of 1485, rode Henry Tudor, and then, on a hot August morning at a place called Bosworth Field, everything changed. Henry Tudor, a Lancastrian claimant whose hold on royal blood was slender at best, rode out to face the reigning King Richard III in what would prove to be the last great battle of the Wars of the Roses. Richard III, despite commanding a larger force, was killed in the fighting, reportedly cut down after riding out personally to try to end the battle by killing Henry himself. When the dust settled and the bodies were counted, Henry Tudor stood victorious. He was proclaimed king on the battlefield. The crown, stripped from Richard's head, was placed upon his own. He became Henry VII of England, the first of the Tudors. But victory on a battlefield does not automatically confer legitimacy. Henry VII understood this with the cold clarity of a man who had spent most of his life in exile, thinking carefully about power and how it was won, and more importantly, how it was kept. His Lancastrian claim to the throne was, by any honest reckoning, weak. His descent from John of Gaunt, the son of Edward III, ran through an illegitimate line, the Beaufort family, who had been legitimised by Act of Parliament, but in terms that specifically excluded them from the royal succession. His right to the crown was, by strict genealogical standards, inferior to that of several living Yorkist claimants. There were other claimants, Yorkist claimants, whose blood ran closer to the old royal line than his own. The nobility of England had seen kings come and go with alarming speed. They were not, as a body, inclined to simply accept the new order without watching carefully to see whether it would hold. Henry VII's hold on the throne was, in those first years, always potentially provisional, dependent on his ability to prevent any credible alternative from emerging, and to demonstrate through his governance and his alliances that the Tudor dynasty was here to stay. Henry needed something more than a battlefield victory. He needed legitimacy. He needed unity. He needed a symbol that the long years of war were truly over. He found his answer in marriage. Elizabeth of York was the daughter of the late King Edward IV, a Yorkist king, a beloved one, the man whose death had set the final catastrophic sequence of the Wars of the Roses in motion. She was 20 years old, fair-haired, gentle in manner, and in terms of royal bloodlines, she was exactly what Henry VII needed. By marrying her, he would unite the two warring houses, Lancaster and York, within a single family. Their children would carry both bloodlines. The red rose and the white rose would, in the heraldic language of the age, bloom together as one. There is a tendency, sometimes, to think of this marriage as purely political. Two people brought together by calculation and dynastic necessity, with no feeling between them. The evidence does not quite support that reading. Henry VII was not, by any account, a warm or demonstratively affectionate man. He was reserved, self-contained, careful with himself as he was careful with everything else. But the accounts of his grief at Elizabeth's death suggest that what he felt for her went beyond the merely strategic. He had chosen her partly for what she represented, yes, but in the years of their marriage, she had also become, apparently, the person who knew him best and steadied him most reliably. When she died in 1503, something went out of him that never came back. Henry and Elizabeth married on the 18th of January, 1486, just a few months after Bosworth. The union was celebrated with genuine warmth by a people weary of conflict, and almost immediately, Elizabeth was pregnant. It was at this point that Henry VII did something that tells us everything we need to know about the kind of man he was and the kind of king he intended to be. He turned his mind to the name and the birthplace of his unborn child. He chose Winchester. Winchester was not simply a city. In the imagination of medieval England, Winchester was something altogether more significant. It was believed to be the site of Camelot, the legendary court of King Arthur, the greatest king Britain had ever known. The Round Table, or what passed for it, a great circular disc of painted wood that still hangs in Winchester's Great Hall to this day, was taken as physical proof of the legend's reality. Henry VII, who was Welsh and keenly aware of the Welsh origins of the Arthurian mythology, believed, or at least chose to present himself as believing, that the Tudors were descended from the ancient British kings, from the lineage of Arthur himself. The Arthurian mythology was not simply a pleasant legend in the world of medieval England. It was a piece of cultural and political furniture that carried enormous weight. Arthur, in the stories that had accumulated around him over the centuries, stories elaborated by Geoffrey of Monmouth, refined by Thomas Malory, known to every literate person in England, was the ideal king, just, courageous, surrounded by the best knights in the world, presiding over a golden age of peace and honour. He was the king who would come again, the legend promised, when England most needed him, the once and future king, sleeping beneath the hills, waiting to return. If his child was born at Winchester, in the very city of Arthur's Camelot, and if that child was named Arthur, why the symbolism would be almost impossibly powerful. The once and future king returned. The golden age, promised by legend, finally arrived. Elizabeth was transported to Winchester in early September 1486, a journey of some 60 miles along the rough roads of late medieval England. Some historians have speculated that it was the discomfort of this journey, undertaken in the final weeks of pregnancy, that caused the birth to come slightly earlier than expected. Whatever the cause, on the night of the 19th of September, or in the very earliest hours of the 20th, just past midnight, Elizabeth of York gave birth to a boy. He was a month premature. He was small, but he was alive, and he was breathing. And within hours of his arrival, the city of Winchester was filled with the sound of celebration. Bonfires were lit in the streets. The Te Deum, the great hymn of thanksgiving, was sung at Winchester Cathedral. Messengers rode out across England carrying the news. The heir had arrived. The dynasty had its prince. The child was baptized 4 days later at Winchester Cathedral in a ceremony of considerable grandeur. His godfathers were John de Vere, the 13th Earl of Oxford, and Thomas Stanley, the 1st Earl of Derby, two of the most powerful noblemen in England. Their presence at the font, a statement of political commitment to the new dynasty. His grandmother, Elizabeth Woodville, the widow of King Edward IV, a formidable woman who had herself survived the full storm of the Wars of the Roses, served as godmother. His aunt, Cecily of York, Elizabeth's sister, carried the baby prince into the church, and they named him Arthur. The name rang through the cathedral like a prophecy. It was not a common royal name. No king of England had borne it in recorded history. Its choice was entirely deliberate, entirely symbolic. Henry VII was announcing, in the most public way he knew how, that a new age had come. that the wounds of the past were healed, that England's golden age, promised by the old legends, had at last begun. Whether Arthur himself, growing up in the shadow of that enormous expectation, ever found it comfortable is another question entirely. The nursery that welcomed the young prince was managed initially by Elizabeth, Lady Darcy, who had served in the royal household of the late King Edward IV, and thus brought reassuring continuity and experience to her role. Arthur was given a wet nurse named Caroline Gibbons, and 2 royal rockers were appointed specifically to tend his cradle, rocking the future King of England gently through the quiet hours of infancy. 2 senior churchmen, John Alcock, Bishop of Worcester, and Peter Courtenay, Bishop of Exeter, were consulted by the king on matters relating to Arthur's upbringing and future education, a sign of how seriously Henry VII took the project of preparing his heir from the very beginning. The royal nursery was established at Farnham, and it was there that Arthur spent his earliest years, removed from the noise and hazard of the court, carefully tended, watched over, and gradually introduced to the formal rituals that would define his life. Farnham Castle, the residence of the Bishop of Winchester, was a secure and comfortable establishment, removed from the political turbulence of the royal court, but close enough to London that the king could receive regular reports of his son's progress and visit when his duties permitted. The nursery staff who surrounded the young prince were carefully chosen for their reliability and experience. Nothing about Arthur's upbringing was left to chance if Henry VII could help it. The world outside the nursery walls was not always tranquil. In the months following Arthur's birth, Henry VII was still securing his hold on the kingdom, dealing with the aftermath of the Bosworth campaign, managing the transition from one royal administration to another, navigating the complex expectations of a nobility that had served different kings in recent years and was now recalibrating itself to the requirements of the new order. There were plots, there were rumours, there were men who had made their careers under the Yorkist kings and who watched the new Tudor court with guarded, waiting eyes. Henry moved through all of this with his characteristic controlled alertness, and the small child at Farnham, the future upon whom everything depended, was kept safely apart from it. The royal nursery was established at Farnham, and it was there that Arthur spent his earliest years, removed from the noise and hazard of the court, carefully tended, watched over, and gradually introduced to the formal rituals that would define his life. He was, by all accounts, a healthy and cheerful infant. The fears that his prematurity had initially provoked did not persist. He grew, he thrived, and as he grew, the world around him began the long, careful work of shaping him into the king he was meant to become. In those earliest years, before the machinery of education and formal preparation had fully claimed him, Arthur was simply a child, one of several children, for Elizabeth of York would go on to have other sons and daughters in the years that followed his birth. Margaret was born in 1489. Henry, the future Henry VIII, arrived in 1491. Mary came in 1496. There were other children who did not survive infancy, as was tragically common in the royal families of the age. But Arthur was the eldest, and the eldest was always different, the one around whom the most expectation gathered, the one whose life was most thoroughly shaped by the demands of what he was to become. He learned to walk and talk in the royal nursery at Farnham. He learned to ride, as all noble children did, at an age when most children today would still be thought too young for such things. He was introduced, gradually and with careful attention, to what a royal child of his age could absorb, to the religious rituals that would form the framework of his daily life, the prayers, the masses, the feast days and fasts of the Catholic calendar that governed the rhythm of existence in late 15th century England. He was baptized Catholic, raised Catholic, educated in the traditions of a faith that was then still the universal church of Western Europe, the same faith that his future bride was being raised in on the other side of the continent, with an intensity that would mark her for the rest of her life. The relationship between Arthur and his younger siblings is almost entirely undocumented in the sources that survive. We do not know whether he and the future Henry VIII were close in the way that brothers can be close. We know that when Henry escorted Catherine to the altar at their wedding, he was 10 years old enough to understand something of the significance of the occasion, young enough that his role was still cast in the language of childlike service to his elder brother. Henry would later become the most documented king in English history. His voice, his character, his desires and rages and affections preserved in more detail than almost any other English monarch before or since. Arthur, who died before that documentary apparatus could be turned to his own personality, remains by contrast quiet and somewhat opaque. We see him through the formal records of his investitures and his council and his wedding and his death, but not clearly through any personal testimony of his own beyond the stiff, correct Latin letters that survive in the archives. When Arthur was not yet 2 years old, before he could properly walk, before he could frame more than the simplest words, negotiations began for his marriage. This was not unusual in the world of royal diplomacy. Marriages between the children of great houses were arranged almost from birth, the children themselves having no more say in the matter than pieces on a chessboard. What was notable about Arthur's betrothal negotiations was the ambition of the match that Henry VII had in mind. He wanted a Spanish princess. Ferdinand II of Aragon and Isabella III of Castile were, in the late 1480s, the most powerful monarchs in Western Europe. Together, they ruled a unified Spain that was at that very moment funding the voyages of Christopher Columbus to the New World, driving the Moors from their last strongholds on the Iberian Peninsula and projecting Spanish power across the Mediterranean and beyond. To marry a child of theirs was to announce to every court in Europe that England under the Tudors had arrived, that this new dynasty, born out of a battle on a muddy English field, was fit to sit at the table of the great powers. The Spanish monarchs were also, crucially, the most religiously committed rulers of their age. Ferdinand and Isabella had earned the title Catholic monarchs from the Pope himself, a designation that reflected not merely their personal piety, but the specific, politically charged character of their religion, which was at the center of everything they had accomplished. The reconquest of Spain, the centuries-long campaign to reclaim the Iberian Peninsula from Moorish rule, had reached its triumphant conclusion in 1492 with the fall of Granada. That same year, they had expelled the Jews from Spain. In their vision of a unified Catholic Spain, religion and political power were inseparable. Their youngest daughter would carry this inheritance with her wherever she went. Ferdinand and Isabella had several children. Their youngest daughter, born on the 16th of December 1485, just a few months before Arthur himself, was named Catalina. She would come to be known in England as Catherine. It was Catherine, the youngest surviving child of the Catholic monarchs of Spain, who was chosen for Arthur. The negotiations began in 1488, the year Henry VII sent ambassadors to the Spanish court. By March 1489, those negotiations had produced a formal agreement, the Treaty of Medina del Campo, in which the basic terms of the match were set out. Catherine would come to England to marry Arthur when both children were of age. She would bring a dowry of 200,000 scudos. England and Spain would be bound in alliance, a counterweight to the ambitions of France on the European stage. The Treaty of Medina del Campo was a triumph of diplomatic patience and political calculation on both sides. For Henry VII, it represented precisely the kind of European recognition he needed, a formal, binding agreement with the two most powerful monarchs in Western Christendom that acknowledged his dynasty as a peer among equals. For Ferdinand and Isabella, it offered a reliable ally on France's northern flank, a Protestant-proof bulwark against the ambitions of the French crown that had long threatened Spanish interests on the continent. Both sides had much to gain. Both sides had much to protect. The negotiations had not been simple. Ferdinand and Isabella were experienced diplomats who had spent decades navigating the complex, often treacherous terrain of European political marriage-making. They drove hard bargains. The dowry terms were discussed and revised. The age at which Catherine would actually depart for England was a subject of lengthy debate. The Spanish monarchs wanted guarantees of their daughter's treatment and security in England. Henry VII wanted guarantees of the dowry payments and the diplomatic obligations that came with them. Ambassador after ambassador crossed the Channel in both directions, carrying letters and counter-proposals, negotiating the details of a match between children who were, at the time, still learning to walk. But the agreement was eventually reached, and it held. The Treaty of Medina del Campo set in motion a chain of events that would unfold across the next 12 years and culminate in the extraordinary spectacle of a royal wedding in Old St. Paul's Cathedral on a November morning in 1501. At the time of the treaty's signing, Catherine was 3 years old. Arthur was 2. They would not meet for another 12 years. In November 1489, when Arthur was just past his 3rd birthday, the formal ceremonies of his investiture as heir began. On the 29th of November, he was made a Knight of the Bath. On the 30th, the very next day, he was formally created Prince of Wales and Earl of Chester, the titles that would mark him as heir apparent to the English throne for the rest of his life. His formal investiture as Prince of Wales followed on the 27th of February the following year, 1490, at the Palace of Westminster. In 1491, he was made a Knight of the Garter, the highest order of chivalry in England. Each of these ceremonies was a statement. Each was a public performance of the dynasty's confidence, its permanence, its right to be taken seriously. Henry VII understood the power of spectacle, and he deployed it with considerable skill. But ceremonies were one thing. The real work of preparing Arthur for kingship was another matter entirely. His formal education began in earnest once he was past the very earliest years of childhood. His first tutor was John Reed, a man of considerable scholarly reputation, the former headmaster of Winchester College, one of the great educational institutions of medieval England. Under Reedy, Arthur began his instruction in the fundamentals of learning: Latin, the universal language of scholarship and diplomacy; grammar, the foundation of all communication; history, the record of how kingdoms rose and fell. He was taught to read and to write with the care that the heir to a throne required, knowing that his letters and proclamations would one day carry the weight of royal authority. The study of Latin was, in the intellectual world of the late 15th century, not simply the acquisition of a language, it was the acquisition of an entire civilization, the civilization of ancient Rome, whose governance and philosophy and literature were considered the most important models available to anyone thinking seriously about how human societies should be organized and how individuals should conduct themselves within them. To read Cicero in the original was to engage directly with the thinking of the man who had done more than almost anyone else in the ancient world to articulate the principles of republican governance and civic virtue. To read Virgil was to encounter the great epic of Roman identity, the story of Aeneas and the founding of Rome, which carried within it a vision of duty and destiny that a prince preparing to rule could hardly ignore. To read the historians, Livy, Suetonius, Tacitus, was to study the patterns of how power was won and lost, how empires rose and collapsed, what the ambitions of leaders and the failures of judgment had cost entire peoples across the centuries. Arthur read all of these. He read them with the guidance of tutors who understood that a prince's education was not merely about acquiring knowledge, but about forming character, about developing the kind of judgment and self-discipline and long-range thinking that good governance required. Arthur was a diligent student. Contemporary accounts describe him as thoughtful and reserved, a boy who absorbed knowledge carefully and expressed himself with a certain deliberate precision. He was not, by the accounts that survive, a particularly warm or spontaneous child. David Starkey, the Tudor historian, has written of what he describes as Arthur's driven, solitary childhood, noting that the result was a model prince who carried about him the exaggerated sense of responsibility of the eldest child. Starkey also observed that Arthur was intellectually precocious, ahead of his age in terms of scholarly development, but that he had a rather stiff public manner, as though the weight of expectation had settled early on his young shoulders and never quite lifted. Arthur was also interested, alongside his more formal academic work, in the physical accomplishments that were expected of any prince of his time. He was a keen archer, archery being both a martial skill and a gentlemanly recreation in the world of late medieval England. He enjoyed dancing, which was not merely an entertainment, but an art form considered appropriate to the dignity of a courtly education, a way of moving through the world with grace and proportion. He watched the jousts and tournaments of the age with the keen attention of a young man who understood that these displays of martial skill were both entertainment and political theatre, performances of aristocratic identity in which strength and technique and courage were put on display for an audience that understood their significance. Around 1493, when Arthur was approximately 7 years old, a significant change came to his life, following a precedent established by his maternal grandfather, King Edward IV, who had sent his own sons to Ludlow to learn the arts of governance. Henry VII dispatched Arthur to Ludlow Castle in the Welsh Marches. Ludlow was not a punishment, nor was it an exile, though it must have felt something like both to a small boy leaving his family behind. It was, rather, an education of a particular kind, a practical apprenticeship in the realities of royal power. Ludlow Castle stood on a rocky outcrop above the River Tame in Shropshire, on the border between England and Wales, and it served as the seat of the Council of Wales and the Marches, the administrative body through which royal authority was projected across this sometimes turbulent borderland. As Prince of Wales, Arthur was the nominal head of this council, the figurehead around whom its authority gathered. In practice, of course, the council's real work was done by experienced administrators and councillors who surrounded the young prince and guided his understanding of how government actually functioned. But Arthur's presence there was not merely ceremonial. He was expected to observe, to learn, to begin to understand the weight of the responsibilities that would one day be entirely his own. His council included some of the most trusted figures in the Tudor establishment. His great-uncle Jasper Tudor, the Duke of Bedford, Henry VII's most loyal supporter and the man who had sheltered the young Henry himself through years of exile, served as justiciar for South Wales, lending the council the authority of the king's own blood. Sir Rhys ap Thomas, one of Henry VII's great Welsh allies, served as Chamberlain of South Wales, and Sir Richard Pole, the king's cousin, was a key member of Arthur's household. His wife, Lady Margaret Pole, was a niece of King Edward IV, and thus a cousin of Queen Elizabeth herself, a connection that would prove quietly important later in Arthur's story. Ludlow Castle, for all its political significance, was a spare and sometimes difficult place to live. The building had been constructed for defence and administration, not comfort. Its stone halls could be cold and damp in the long Welsh winters. The winds that swept down from the hills carried a chill that no amount of tapestry or fireplace could entirely dispel. Arthur's schoolroom was identified in the solar block of the castle, where windows large enough to admit good light allowed him to read and write through the shorter winter days. He studied there, in those bright, cold rooms, far from his family, surrounded by men whose role was as much to shape a future king as to keep him company. David Starkey's phrase, "driven, solitary childhood," carries particular weight when we picture Arthur at Ludlow. He was not friendless, and he was not mistreated, but he was alone in the way that heirs to great positions are often alone, at a remove from ordinary companionship, always conscious of what he was and what he was expected to become. The household at Ludlow was not small. Arthur was surrounded by a considerable staff of administrators, servants, tutors, and household officers. But the social world available to a prince in training was necessarily restricted in ways that the household of an ordinary nobleman's child would not have been. He could not simply go out and play with the children of Ludlow town. He could not form friendships freely, without the awareness that those friendships carried political significance in a world where every relationship a future king had was potentially a vehicle for influence or obligation. Around this time, the broader world of Arthur's education was expanding in ways that reflected the intellectual ferment of the age. The 1490s were a period of extraordinary cultural flowering in England. The Renaissance, that great rebirth of classical learning and humanist thought that had already transformed Italy, was beginning to reach northern Europe, and England was part of that transformation. The scholars who gathered at the English court included some of the finest minds of the generation. Erasmus of Rotterdam, the great Dutch humanist, visited England during these years and formed friendships with English scholars. Thomas More, who would one day become one of the most famous Englishmen who ever lived, was coming of age in this same intellectual world. Arthur was educated in the midst of this ferment. Around 1496, when he was 10 years old, a new and more influential tutor took over his instruction. Bernard André was a French Augustinian friar, blind from an early age, who had come to England in the service of the Tudors and had established himself as one of the most accomplished Latin poets and chroniclers at the court of Henry VII. André was, by his own account, deeply impressed with his royal pupil. He wrote of Arthur's facility with classical Latin texts, his ability to hold intellectual conversations in that language, and his diligence as a scholar. Under André's instruction, Arthur's education took on a more distinctly humanist character. The reading of classical Greek and Latin authors not merely as linguistic exercises, but as moral and philosophical guides to the life of a virtuous ruler. Thomas Linacre, who joined Arthur's household somewhat later as the prince approached his early teens, brought yet another dimension to this education. Linacre was an English humanist of the first rank, a physician and scholar who had studied in Italy, had been taught by some of the greatest classical scholars in Europe, and who counted among his other pupils Erasmus himself, as well as Thomas More. Linacre would go on to become royal physician and to found the Royal College of Physicians in London, a measure of the extraordinary intellectual distinction he carried with him. That Arthur Tudor, as a boy in Ludlow, was taught by this man speaks to the seriousness with which Henry VII approached the project of his son's formation. Arthur was receiving the finest education that early 16th century England could provide, not because Henry VII was a particularly indulgent father, but because the quality of the king his son became would reflect directly on the dynasty he had built. Arthur's curriculum under these men was broad and rigorous. Grammar, rhetoric, poetry, ethics, history. the full range of what the Renaissance considered essential for a prince who would rule wisely. He studied in Latin and in French. He read the classical authors, Cicero, Virgil, the historians of Rome, understanding that their wisdom was considered directly applicable to the challenges of governance. He developed an elegant hand. He wrote letters, including, as we shall see, formal Latin correspondence to the young princess in Spain, who was to be his wife, that demonstrated both his learning and his sense of the dignity his position required. In 1492, when Arthur was 6 years old, Henry VII made a significant journey to France, a diplomatic expedition that underlined the importance England's new king placed on establishing himself in the councils of European power. While the king was away, Arthur was named Keeper of England and the king's lieutenant, a largely ceremonial designation, but a symbolically important one. The heir to the throne, even at 6 years old, was being positioned as the vessel of royal authority in his father's absence. It is worth pausing here to consider what Arthur's life at Ludlow actually looked like day to day, because so much of the attention that history has given him focuses on the great set-piece moments, the diplomatic ceremonies, and the wedding and the death, and rather less on the long, quiet years of preparation that formed the foundation of his character. He rose early. As was the custom of the age, he attended chapel. He studied through the morning hours, reading and translating texts under the guidance of his tutors, learning to construct arguments in Latin prose, memorizing passages from the classical authors that he would be expected to know for the rest of his life. In the afternoons, there was time for physical exercise, archery in the castle's grounds, perhaps riding out into the countryside of the Welsh marches, which was not without its beauty even in the greyest of seasons. He would have observed the workings of the council that met in his name, watching the administrators of his household deal with the practical business of governance, disputes over land, questions of law, the endless administration that was the true substance of royal power. He wrote letters. They survive, some of them, in archives. Stiff, careful Latin compositions, formal in the way that all his correspondence was formal, but revealing in their own way of a young man who understood his responsibilities and took them seriously. When he wrote to his future wife, these careful, courtly letters in Latin, sent across the length of Europe to a girl he had never met, one can only wonder what he imagined when he set down his pen and thought about her. Did he picture her at all? Did the idea of a real, living person at the end of that diplomatic correspondence seem quite real to him? They were, in their way, strangers exchanging pleasantries across a very great distance, bound together by treaties and the ambitions of their fathers. Meanwhile, on the other side of those treaties, Catherine was growing up in the palaces of Spain, the Alhambra at Granada, the royal palace at Alcalá de Henares, where she had been born, the great castles of Castile and Aragon that formed the backdrop of her childhood. She was being educated with equal care and equal seriousness. Ferdinand and Isabella, the Catholic monarchs, were among the most formidably capable rulers of the age, and they wanted their daughter prepared for the role she would play on the European stage. She spoke Spanish and Latin, understood French and some Greek. She was devout, deeply Catholic in the faith that her parents had made the cornerstone of their identities. She was, by all accounts, intelligent and strong-willed, beneath a surface of composed and gentle dignity. She too was waiting for the journey that would carry her to England, to the prince whose Latin letters arrived from time to time across the continent, to the life that had been decided for her before she could form her own desires. Back in England, the road to that marriage was not smooth. Henry VII's dynasty was still young, still fragile in some ways, and the threats that surrounded it did not disappear simply because England wanted them to. The years of Arthur's boyhood were not years of untroubled peace for the Tudor dynasty, whatever the bonfires and celebrations of 1486 might have suggested. Henry VII was a deeply cautious man, cautious about money, cautious about trust, cautious above all about the security of the throne he had won, and he had reason to be. The court at Westminster in these years was a place of careful surfaces and watchful eyes. Henry VII presided over it with a contained, deliberate authority that impressed those around him without inviting the warmth that might have made him loved. He was not a king who inspired devotion in the way that some monarchs do, not a warrior in the mould of the Plantagenets, not a charismatic force of nature. He was something rarer, and in some ways more valuable, a man of extraordinary political intelligence who understood with perfect clarity that the work of building a dynasty was not the same as the work of winning a battle, and that the second of those things was in many ways easier than the first. He kept detailed account books, recording his personal expenditures in his own hand, with the attention of a man who understood that wealth was the foundation of power, and that waste was the enemy of stability. He paid his debts. He rewarded loyalty, carefully, proportionately, never so extravagantly that the reward created a dangerous obligation in the other direction. He punished disloyalty with a patience that could be unsettling in its precision. Henry II did not forget, and he did not necessarily hurry. He was, in the assessment of the historian who understands both his achievements and his methods, one of the most competent kings England ever had. He was not, by any account, an easy man to love. His relationship with his own heir is not well documented in the sources that survive. We do not know how often Henry VII visited Arthur at Ludlow, how their conversations went, whether the prince found his father intimidating or reassuring, or simply the central, inescapable authority of his existence. We know that Henry VII took every possible step to secure Arthur's future: the education, the marriage negotiations, the investitures and ceremonies that made the heir's existence a public and political fact. Whether there was warmth between them, the ordinary warmth of a father and son finding each other across the distances that rank and duty imposed, is something the historical record does not preserve. He kept meticulous financial records. He cultivated alliances with care. He watched for threats from every direction, from the old Yorkist nobility, who had not forgotten their former loyalties, from the European courts, who watched England's new king with measured curiosity, from the simple unpredictability of fortune that could undo the most careful calculations. He was, in the phrase that historians have used of him, a survivor, and survivors develop habits of vigilance that never entirely leave them. The Wars of the Roses had not simply ended at Bosworth. The underlying tensions, the competing claims, the Yorkist loyalties that persisted in certain quarters of the nobility, the simple human resistance to accepting that things had truly, permanently changed, continued to generate threats, real and imagined, against the Tudor hold on power. The first great test of the dynasty's security came in the form of a pretender. Lambert Simnel was a boy of obscure origins who was put forward in 1487 as a Yorkist claimant to the throne, first as Edward, Earl of Warwick, and then, when that proved untenable, as Edward the Thaw's nephew. He was crowned King of Ireland in Dublin by Yorkist sympathisers, and an army was raised to invade England on his behalf. Henry VII defeated this army at the Battle of Stokefield in June 1487, the last pitched battle of the Wars of the Roses, though it is not always remembered as such, and the pretender himself was captured. In a characteristic act of shrewd mercy, Henry chose not to execute the boy, who was clearly a pawn rather than an instigator. Instead, he put him to work in the royal kitchens, where he reportedly spent the remainder of his life. eventually rising to the position of royal falconer. It was the kind of decision that revealed something important about Henry VII, a man capable of calculating mercy when it served him, and calculating severity when that served him better. The Simnel Rebellion had exposed a genuine vulnerability in the Tudor position. The Yorkist nobility was not uniformly reconciled to the new order. There were men in England who remembered the reigns of Edward IV and Richard III with something other than relief at their passing, and who watched the Tudor dynasty with the careful, guarded attention of people waiting to see whether it would last. Any pretender who could credibly claim a Yorkist identity might attract support from these quarters, and the mere existence of such support, the mere possibility of a rallying point, was a constant source of anxiety to a king who understood how thin the line between a stable dynasty and a destabilized one could be. But the deeper threat that Simnel represented did not disappear with his defeat. That threat was embodied in a name: Edward Plantagenet, the 17th Earl of Warwick. The real Earl of Warwick, not Simnel's impersonation of him, was at this point a young man of about 12 years old, the nephew of both Edward IV and Richard III, and by the reckoning of Yorkist loyalists, the rightful heir to the English throne. He had done nothing wrong. He was, by all accounts, a gentle and somewhat simple young man who had spent most of his childhood in captivity. Henry VII had imprisoned him in the Tower of London almost immediately upon taking the throne, recognizing the threat that his mere existence posed to the dynasty. There he remained, year after year, through all the years of Arthur's childhood and education, a prisoner not for anything he had done, but for what he was, a symbol around which Yorkist discontent could crystallize. Warwick had not chosen to be born a Plantagenet. He had not conspired against the Tudor crown, at least not in any way that the historical record convincingly demonstrates. He was, in the assessment of later generations, simply unlucky, born into the wrong family at the wrong moment in history, a gentleman in a brutal world whose only crime was his lineage. But in the political calculus of the late 15th century, lineage was itself a form of danger, and Henry VII was not a man who could afford to ignore danger in any form. In the late 1490s, a second and more dangerous pretender appeared. Perkin Warbeck was a young Flemish man of considerable charm and intelligence who claimed to be Richard, Duke of York, the younger of the two so-called princes in the Tower, the sons of Edward IV, who had disappeared after being placed in the Tower by Richard III and had never been seen again. Whether Richard and his brother had been murdered, or had died of natural causes, or had somehow escaped their confinement, remained a genuine mystery, and Warbeck's claim, however implausible in retrospect, found support in some surprising quarters. The kings of France and Scotland both gave him shelter and recognition at various points. Irish support rallied to his cause. He made several attempts to land in England with small armies, each repulsed by Henry VII's forces. Warbeck's challenge represented something more complex than simple rebellion. The question of what had become of the princes in the Tower was one that haunted the political imagination of the age. If Richard, Duke of York, had somehow survived his imprisonment and was now making his claim, if Henry VII was sitting on a throne that belonged by right to a living Plantagenet prince, then the Tudor dynasty's entire legitimacy was in question. Henry could not, of course, prove that Richard was dead. The princes had disappeared, and their fate had never been publicly established. The very uncertainty gave Warbeck's claim a foothold in the minds of those who wanted to believe it, and some who did not especially want to believe it, but found the strategic value of appearing to believe it too great to ignore. Warbeck was finally captured in 1497. After his last attempt at rebellion collapsed, Henry treated him initially with a degree of leniency, allowing him to live at court rather than consigning him immediately to the Tower. But Warbeck proved incapable of accepting defeat. He attempted to escape, was recaptured, and was placed in the Tower alongside the real Earl of Warwick. And here the story takes a darker turn, one that is directly connected to Arthur's marriage and to the price that Henry VII was willing to pay for his dynasty's future. Ferdinand and Isabella had been in negotiations with Henry VII for years about the terms of Arthur and Catherine's marriage. The treaty had been signed. The betrothal had been arranged, then arranged again by proxy. But the Spanish monarchs were not yet willing to actually send their daughter to England. England, they felt, was not yet stable enough. There were still too many rival claimants, too many potential pretenders. Ferdinand and Isabella did not want their youngest daughter arriving at a court that might be toppled before the wedding could even take place. The logic of their position was not unreasonable. From the perspective of parents who had just achieved an extraordinary political triumph, the unification of Spain, the completion of the Reconquest, and who were not inclined to risk their daughter's security and the prestige of the Spanish crown on a dynasty that had not yet proved it could survive. They had seen what happened to political alliances built on foundations of sand. They were not going to add their daughter to that history if they could avoid it. They were particularly concerned about the Earl of Warwick. As long as he lived, as long as there existed, within the Tower of London, a Yorkist prince with a credible claim to the English throne, there would always be the possibility of a rebellion rallying around him. Ferdinand reportedly made it clear to Henry that he would not consent to Catherine's departure for England while Warwick remained alive. The Spanish chronicler Raphael Holinshed recorded that Ferdinand had said he would make no full conclusion of the matrimony to be had between Prince Arthur and the Lady Catherine, nor send her into England as long as this Earl lived. The Spanish ambassador in London wrote in the same vein. The message was unmistakable. Henry VII faced a choice. On one side, the most advantageous marriage his son could possibly make, the alliance with Spain that would cement the Tudor dynasty's standing in Europe, the political triumph of a decade's careful negotiation. On the other side, a young man who had done nothing wrong, who had been a prisoner since childhood, who represented no active threat, but who, by his very existence, was an inconvenience to the match. Henry chose the match. In the autumn of 1499, a plot was engineered. The precise details remain murky and disputed, in which Warbeck and Warwick were accused of conspiring together to escape from the Tower. Whether they actually conspired, or whether the plot was manufactured to give Henry the legal cover he needed, is a question historians have never satisfactorily resolved. The evidence suggests, to many modern readers, that the plot may have been at least partly a fabrication, or that Warwick, who was not especially sophisticated in political matters, may have been drawn into an arrangement without fully understanding its implications. He was accused, tried before his peers, found guilty, and sentenced to death. Perkin Warbeck was hanged at Tyburn on the 23rd of November, 1499. Edward Plantagenet, the 17th Earl of Warwick, was beheaded on Tower Hill 5 days later, on the 28th of November, 1499. He was 24 years old. He had spent 14 years in the Tower. He had never had a life, never had the ordinary experiences of a young man of his rank, never governed an estate or pursued the interests that his education might have given him, or formed the relationships that might have made his years on earth something other than a long, comfortable imprisonment. Henry VII paid for his body to be taken to Bisham Abbey in Berkshire for burial, a small, perhaps guilty gesture of respect toward a man whose death had served his purposes so well. The Spanish ambassador in England, Rodrigo González de Puebla, wrote to Ferdinand and Isabella after Warwick's execution with something that sounds, Even through the diplomatic formality of his prose, like relief, England has never before been so tranquil and obedient as at present. The implicit message was clear. The obstacle had been removed. The path to the marriage was now open. Catherine of Aragon, who learned of these executions later in life and reflected upon them, reportedly said that innocent blood had been shed for her marriage to begin. It was a remarkable thing to acknowledge that the union into which she had entered as a girl of 15 had been, in some sense, purchased with a man's life. It suggests that Catherine, even as she accepted the marriage that had been arranged for her, understood something of the moral cost at which it had been obtained. She was, in this as in many things, more perceptive than those around her might have wished. Arthur, 13 years old at the time, in his cold schoolroom at Ludlow, presumably knew something of these political calculations. A prince in training could not have been entirely shielded from the great events of his father's reign. Whether he understood the full human cost of what had been done is impossible to say. The world was shaped by his father's decisions, and he moved through it accordingly, as heirs to great dynasties have always moved through worlds shaped by others. The proxy ceremonies that marked the formal stages of the betrothal proceeded through these years. In August 1497, Arthur and Catherine were betrothed by proxy at Woodstock, a ceremony in which representatives stood in for the actual parties, speaking the words of commitment on their behalf across hundreds of miles of sea and land. In 1499, a second proxy marriage took place at Tickenhill Manor in Bewdley. Arthur was 13 years old. Catherine was 13. The final terms of their marriage agreement were settled by 1500. These proxy ceremonies were not merely symbolic gestures. They carried genuine legal weight in the canon law of the age, creating obligations and impediments that could be enforced or annulled only with difficulty. The elaborate repetition of the betrothal ceremony, its staging in multiple forms across multiple years, reflected the deep seriousness with which both sides regarded the alliance and the need to bind it in every available legal form before the actual marriage could take place. For Arthur, these ceremonies were perhaps the most direct form of contact he had with the reality of the woman he was to marry. He participated in the rituals, spoke the formal words, received the reports of ambassadors who had seen and spoken with Catherine in Spain. He wrote his careful Latin letters. He waited with the patience that his education and his temperament both encouraged for the day when the abstract reality of a treaty would become the concrete reality of a person. What did Catherine know of Arthur during these years? She had her own sources of information. Ambassadors, reports, the letters that arrived from across the Channel. She had heard that he was studious and reserved, that he carried himself with the dignity of a prince, that the English court regarded him with pride and expectation. She had heard, no doubt, of the magnificent preparations being made for their marriage, of the scale of celebration that Henry VII intended. She had her own imagination, shaped by the world of Spanish royalty and the courtly literature of the age, to fill in what the reports left blank. Now all that remained was for Catherine to actually make the journey. On the 21st of May 1501, Catherine of Aragon left the Alhambra Palace in Granada, the exquisite Moorish palace that had been the last great stronghold of the Moorish rulers of Spain, before Ferdinand and Isabella had claimed it, and began the long journey north to the coast. She was 15 years old. She would not see her parents again. Let us pause on that sentence for a moment, because it carries within it an enormous weight that the formal language of diplomatic history tends to pass over. Catherine was 15 years old. She was leaving the home she had grown up in, the palace whose gardens and fountains and carved stone arches she had known since childhood, the court of her parents, the country of her language and her faith and her whole formation as a person. She was not going on a visit. She was not embarking on a temporary journey. She was leaving permanently to become the wife of a young man she had never met, in a country whose language she did not speak, whose customs were foreign to her, whose climate was entirely unlike the warm Andalusian sun she had grown up under. She would spend the rest of her life in England. She would never return to Spain. Isabella of Castile, Catherine's mother, accompanied her daughter as far as she could before the formal farewell. What passed between them in those final hours? What words a great queen found to say to a 15-year-old girl, leaving everything she had ever known, is not recorded in any document that survives. We know only that they said goodbye, and that Catherine, from that moment, was alone in the most fundamental sense, without her family, without her home, moving toward a future that had been decided for her by treaties signed before she could walk. The Alhambra that she left behind was one of the most beautiful buildings in the world, a palace of extraordinary delicacy and intricacy, its walls covered in the carved geometric patterns and calligraphy of Moorish art, its gardens watered by channels that kept the Andalusian heat at bay, its great halls filled with light reflected from pools of still water. It had been captured from Muhammad Tuitin, the last Nasrid Sultan, in January 1492, the culmination of the centuries-long reconquest that had defined Catherine's parents' reign. She had grown up in its courts, surrounded by a beauty and a sophistication that few buildings in Christendom could match. England, in November 1501, would look very different. The journey to the northern Spanish coast alone was an ordeal. Nearly 500 miles overland through the heat of the Castilian summer, over mountain passes and along roads that tested the endurance of even experienced travellers. Catherine's entourage was large. Ladies-in-waiting, her strict Spanish governess, Doña Elvira Manuel, and Doña Elvira's husband, Pedro Manrique, clergy, servants, and the diplomatic personnel who accompanied any princess on a state journey of this magnitude. They moved slowly, as was necessary with such a company. The extreme heat of the Spanish summer and the difficulty of crossing the mountain ranges made the progress hard. It took Catherine and her party nearly 3 months to reach the northern coast of Galicia, the region from which she would sail. A fleet was waiting for her at the port of A Coruña. On the 17th of August, 1501, Catherine and her party boarded their ships and set sail. The Bay of Biscay, which separates the northern coast of Spain from the coast of France, is notoriously treacherous, a body of water where Atlantic storms can come with violent suddenness, and where the meeting of ocean currents creates conditions that have wrecked ships throughout history. The fleet that carried Catherine encountered exactly such conditions. Strong storms battered the ships, sending the great vessels lurching through heavy seas, the timber hulls groaning under the impact of the waves, the passengers below decks enduring the particular misery of severe seasickness in a confined dark space far from any land. The fleet was forced to abandon the crossing and turn back. They made landfall at Laredo near Bilbao, on the northern Spanish coast, where Catherine and her exhausted party had to wait for conditions to improve. The delay lasted weeks. Another failed crossing, and Catherine would have had to return to Spain. The whole endeavour postponed for another year, perhaps longer. When Henry VII in England learned of the failed crossing, he acted with the decisiveness of a man who had been waiting more than a decade for this moment, and was not going to allow a little rough weather to derail it. He sent one of his best naval captains, a man named Stephen Butt, to guide the Spanish fleet through the difficult crossing. Captain Butt brought with him the kind of experience and authority that the Spanish fleet had apparently lacked on the first attempt, a man who knew the English Channel and the Atlantic approaches, who understood the patterns of the weather and the tides, and who could be trusted to bring the princess safely to shore. On the 27th of September 1501, at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, Catherine set sail for the second time. The crossing was not smooth. Storms troubled the fleet again, this time off the coast of Brittany. But this time they pressed on through the difficult conditions rather than turning back. They had originally intended to make landfall at Southampton on the southern English coast, where a formal reception had been prepared and where the roads toward London were relatively well maintained. The storms changed their course. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon of the 2nd of October, 1501, Catherine's ship entered the harbour at Plymouth. She had arrived. After 15 years of waiting, of betrothal ceremonies and proxy marriages and diplomatic correspondence, Catherine of Aragon had reached England. She had arrived. After 15 years of waiting, of betrothal ceremonies and proxy marriages and diplomatic correspondence, Catherine of Aragon had reached England. A Spanish doctor who accompanied her later recorded that she could not have been received at Plymouth with greater rejoicings if she had been the saviour of the world. The people of Plymouth lined the harbour to watch the Spanish princess come ashore. Margaret Beaufort, Henry VII's formidable and intensely pious mother, noted the event in her personal Book of Hours, a volume in which she recorded only the most significant occasions of her life. Plymouth was not, by the standards of the age, an especially grand English city. It was a port town, practical and maritime in character, its streets shaped by the trade of the sea rather than the ceremony of court. But the people who came out to receive Catherine that October afternoon seemed to have done so with genuine warmth and enthusiasm. She was young. She was evidently charming in the composed and dignified way that her upbringing had cultivated, and she represented something that the English public, after the years of instability, were genuinely glad to celebrate. A royal wedding, a dynasty's future, the promise of continuity. Catherine rested at Plymouth for a few days, recovering from the rigours of the crossing, her body and spirit both needing the restoration that only stillness and solid ground could provide. Then her entourage began the slow progress through England's West Country toward London. The journey was not an easy one. November had arrived with its rains, and the roads of medieval England were not designed to accommodate the passage of a large Spanish entourage without some discomfort. But the English people came out to see her as she passed through their towns and villages, at Exeter, at Shaftesbury, along the winding routes through Dorset and Hampshire and Surrey, and the warmth of their welcome seems to have given Catherine something to hold on to through the exhaustion of travel. Henry VII, meanwhile, was not content to wait for Catherine to come to him in the prescribed manner. He was impatient. After all his years of careful diplomacy and patient negotiation, the prize was finally almost within reach, and he decided to go and see her. He rode out from Richmond with his son Arthur to meet the princess at Dogmersfield, a manor house in Hampshire. There was a diplomatic difficulty. Doña Elvira Manuel, Catherine's governess, was a stickler for Spanish court protocol, which held that a princess should not be seen unveiled by her future husband before the wedding. She attempted to enforce this rule and prevent the meeting. Henry VII, who had waited 11 years for this alliance and was not in the mood for ceremony to get in the way, apparently overrode her objections with the directness of a king who was used to getting what he wanted. He and Arthur met Catherine at Dogmersfield. What passed between Arthur and Catherine in those first moments of actual physical meeting, after years of Latin letters and proxy ceremonies and diplomatic intermediaries, is not recorded with any detail. What we do know is that both father and son came away satisfied. Catherine, auburn-haired, composed, dignified in the manner that her Spanish upbringing had cultivated, made a positive impression. She was described by those who saw her at this time as well-made, with a handsome face and a pleasing manner, speaking intelligently through her interpreter. Henry VII was characteristically thorough in his examination. He reportedly looked Catherine over with the sharp, assessing eye of a man who had worked very hard to reach this moment and wanted to make sure everything was as it should be. Arthur, aged 15, meeting the 15-year-old girl he was to marry in a week's time. What did he feel? We can only wonder. The accounts tell us of his composure, his courtesy, the correct and dignified manner with which he conducted himself. They tell us nothing of his interior life at that moment. After the meeting at Dogmersfield, Catherine's journey toward London continued. She spent nights at Hartley Wintney, then moved through Basingstoke, Kingsclere, and various stopping points along the route, drawing ever closer to the city that was waiting to receive her. Henry VII moved ahead to make his own preparations, leaving Arthur to continue in the company of the princess who was almost his wife. They arrived in the vicinity of London on the 9th of November. Catherine spent several days at Lambeth Palace on the south bank of the Thames, resting and preparing for her formal entry into the city. The king's mother, the formidable Lady Margaret Beaufort, may have been among those who greeted her at this stage, bringing the full weight of the Tudor matriarch's blessing to the occasion. Catherine made her formal entry into the city of London on the 12th of November 1501, 2 days before the wedding, and London, in its characteristic fashion, turned the occasion into a spectacle. The route of Catherine's entry procession had been carefully planned and extensively prepared. Great pageants had been erected at various points along the way. Elaborate theatrical constructions that were part architecture, part theatre, part political propaganda, designed to welcome the princess and to make a statement about the city and the dynasty that was receiving her. At Gracechurch Street, a great stage featured the figures of the planets, with a young boy dressed as the sun descending to greet Catherine as the moon. At Cornhill, another elaborate structure celebrated the marriage of England and Spain in imagery drawn from classical mythology and chivalric tradition. At the Conduit in Cheap, a third pageant showed the figure of honour bestowing gifts upon the princess. And at St. Paul's Gate, a final great construction depicted the angel Gabriel, offering Catherine the greeting of heaven itself. These pageants were not simply decorative. They were carefully crafted communications, messages sent in the visual and symbolic language of the age, from the city and the dynasty to the princess who was entering. They said, "You are welcome here." They said, "This marriage is blessed by heaven, endorsed by classical antiquity, celebrated by all the forces of the cosmos." They said, "You are coming to a great and prosperous city, a city worthy of the Princess of Spain." And they said, in the most emphatic terms possible, "The Tudor dynasty is real, it is powerful, it is permanent, and this marriage is its crown." Whether Catherine found all of this overwhelming, the noise, the crowds, the enormous productions staged entirely in her honour, along mile after mile of London street, or whether she found it exhilarating, or some complex mixture of both, we cannot entirely say. She had grown up in the courts of Ferdinand and Isabella, surrounded by ceremony and display of her own. She was not naive about the political theatre of royal life, but this was her first experience of the particular flavour of English celebration. Louder, perhaps, than she had expected, rowdier in some ways, more popular in its energy. The English people who lined the streets to watch her were not simply passive observers of a royal procession. They were participants in it, shouting, cheering, pressing forward for a better view, expressing their enthusiasm in a way that the more formal ceremonies of the Spanish court might not have quite prepared her for. She rode through it all with the composed dignity that was already becoming her signature quality. She was cheered from the moment she entered the city to the moment she arrived at the bishop's palace near St. Paul's, where she would spend the night before her wedding. And 2 days later, on the 14th of November, she would walk through the greatest church in England, on the arm of a 10-year-old boy, toward the young man waiting for her at the altar. The wedding was set for the 14th of November, 1501, at the old St. Paul's Cathedral, not the great Baroque building that would rise on the same site after the Great Fire of London a century and a half later, but its medieval predecessor, a vast Gothic structure that dominated the London skyline and served as the great ceremonial space of English public life. Old St. Paul's was, in its time, one of the largest buildings in England. Its spire, before lightning struck it in 1561, was among the tallest in the world. To hold a royal wedding, there was to hold it at the very heart of England's public life, in the building that more than any other represented the nation's sense of its own significance. Henry VII had spent months preparing for this moment. He was, in the fullest sense of the word, the architect of the occasion, overseeing the preparations with the same meticulous attention he brought to every aspect of his reign, determined that the wedding of his son and heir to the daughter of Spain's greatest monarchs should be exactly what the occasion demanded, magnificent, imposing, and absolutely clear in its statement that the Tudor dynasty had arrived. The physical preparations inside the cathedral were extraordinary. A great wooden platform, 12 feet wide and 350 feet long, had been constructed inside the building, raised 4 feet above the cathedral floor on sturdy struts. Its railings were decorated with fine wool and silk cloth. The stone walls of the ancient building were covered in rich tapestries. Beneath the rose window, surrounding the high altar, gold plate and ornaments and sacred relics encrusted with precious stones had been arranged in a glittering display. A circular dais, raised and carpeted in red, marked the place where the ceremony would reach its culmination. 19 English bishops and abbots were in attendance, alongside their Spanish counterparts, the full weight of the church brought to bear in witness on this union of dynasties. Henry VII himself and Elizabeth of York chose not to process through the streets with the bridal party. They had spent the night at the house of Lord Abergavenny, near to the cathedral, and they observed the ceremony from a small private closet within the building, behind lattice windows that concealed them from the congregation. Henry's reasoning was characteristically shrewd. His presence in the procession would draw attention to him rather than to the bride and groom. The day would belong entirely to Arthur and Catherine. He would watch from the shadows, as he so often watched, and understand what he saw with his precise and calculating eye. On the morning of the 14th of November, Catherine emerged from the bishop's palace dressed in a white satin wedding gown in the Spanish style, a long white satin skirt over a farthingale that created a wide flowing shape, with pleated folds falling from the waist. Her face was covered with a white veil edged in gold, embroidered with pearls. Her hair, that distinctive auburn hair, was worn loose beneath the veil, as tradition demanded for a bride. Her train was carried by Cecily of York, Arthur's aunt, who had carried him at his own baptism 15 years before. The circle of connection was complete. The woman who had carried the infant prince into his baptismal font now carried the train of the bride he would marry, and it was not a Spanish lord or a senior English nobleman who escorted Catherine to the altar. It was a boy, a 10-year-old boy dressed in white and gold, who walked beside her the length of that enormous cathedral as the congregation watched and the music played. That boy was Prince Henry, Arthur's little brother, the child who would one day become Henry VIII, who would one day take this very woman as his own wife, and whose relationship with her would change the course of history. But on this November morning he was simply a 10-year-old prince doing his older brother a service, perhaps not entirely understanding the weight of the moment, perhaps perfectly understanding it in the way that clever, observant children sometimes do. He was, by all accounts, a striking child, already tall for his age, already showing signs of the physical presence that would make him, as a grown man, one of the most imposing figures of his era. He wore his role as Catherine's escort with the easy confidence of a boy who had never been taught to doubt his own significance. Arthur met her at the altar, dressed in his own white satin, both of them in white, an unusual choice that drew comment, white being not yet the established convention for brides that it would later become. Catherine's white had dazzled the English onlookers as she moved down the platform toward him. Arthur, in his own white, waited for her. The sight of the two of them, this Spanish princess and this English prince, both so young, both so carefully prepared for this moment, must have been remarkable. The ceremony was conducted by Henry Dean, the Archbishop of Canterbury, assisted by William Warham, the Bishop of London. It was, by any measure, an elaborate affair. The reading of the marriage agreement, the statement of the dowry terms, the exchange of vows, the blessing, the mass, all of it proceeding with the dignified formality that the occasion required. The service lasted so long that at some point refreshments were provided to the principals, a small human detail that somehow makes the whole enormous ceremony feel briefly, endearingly real. Arthur and Catherine each had, by some accounts, a small shielded enclosure fitted with a commode, a practical concession to the length of the proceedings that speaks, in its way, to the simultaneously grand and pragmatic character of Tudor ceremonial life. After the ceremony, the couple were escorted through the celebrating city to Baynard Castle, one of the great royal residences along the Thames, where the evening's festivities and, eventually, the bridal chamber awaited them. The conduits of London ran with wine that day. The celebrations that followed the ceremony lasted more than 2 weeks. Jousts, pageants, banquets of extraordinary lavishness, the full repertoire of Tudor festivity deployed in honour of the marriage that Henry VII had spent over a decade bringing about. And then came the evening. The bedding ceremony was the expected culmination of any royal marriage. The formal ritual by which the bride and groom were escorted to the bridal chamber and put to bed together, witnessed by the assembled court before the curtains were drawn and the guests withdrew. Catherine was brought into the chamber first, dressed in her nightgown, and she waited. Arthur was carried in eventually by his gentleman, a detail, that word carried, that has sometimes been read as evidence of a young man already weakened by illness, though it may simply reflect the custom of the ceremony. The witnesses withdrew. The couple were left alone. The bridal chamber at Baynard Castle had been prepared with all the care that the occasion demanded. The great bed, the hangings, the candles, the whole elaborate apparatus of a royal consummation. Outside, the court celebrated. The wine continued to flow. The music played. The city of London marked the marriage of its prince with all the festive energy it could muster. Inside the chamber, 2 15-year-olds faced each other in the sudden, absolute quiet that follows when the last guest has gone. What happened next is, as we have noted, the question that history cannot answer. Arthur reportedly emerged from the chamber the following morning and called for a drink, saying he had had a thirsty night, that he had been in the midst of Spain, a boast that his gentleman noted, and that would be repeated in a very different context 30 years later. Catherine, for her part, said nothing, or nothing that was recorded. She moved through the days that followed the wedding with the composed dignity that her upbringing had given her, participating in the ceremonies and celebrations as the new Princess of Wales, giving nothing away. The consummation question, did they or didn't they has been argued by historians and Tudor enthusiasts for 500 years, it may never be definitively resolved. What we can say is that both parties and their circumstances make the question genuinely uncertain, rather than simply rhetorical. Arthur was young, possibly not in perfect health even at the time of the wedding, and the evening had been extraordinarily long and tiring. Catherine was young, had just completed an exhausting journey from Spain, and spoke a different language. The boast Arthur reportedly made in the morning is the kind of thing a 15-year-old boy might say regardless of what had actually occurred, and Catherine's subsequent testimony, maintained under conditions of enormous pressure for the rest of her long life, must be weighed alongside it. We do not know. Perhaps we are not meant to know. Perhaps the uncertainty itself is part of what makes Arthur's story so enduringly compelling. The sense that at the heart of this great historical narrative, there is a private human moment that all the power of kings and popes and archbishops could not ultimately illuminate or control. The celebrations continued for more than 2 weeks, and then it was time to go to Ludlow. The celebrations in London lasted more than 2 weeks. There were more pageants, more jousts, more banquets. The streets of the city buzzed with the afterglow of the great event. The wedding that had announced to all of Europe that England under the Tudors was a power to be taken seriously. But the celebrations could not last forever. The Prince of Wales had duties to return to, and a marriage to begin living in earnest. On the 21st of December 1501, Arthur and Catherine left London for Ludlow Castle. Catherine had celebrated her 16th birthday 5 days earlier, on the 16th. Arthur would not reach his 16th birthday until the following September. They were, by any reckoning, very young. 2 teenagers setting out together into the cold midwinter of the Welsh marches, embarking on a life together in a stone castle far from everything either of them had known. The journey itself was not comfortable. December in England is rarely kind to travellers, and the roads from London to the Welsh borders were long and hard. The daylight hours of the winter solstice were at their shortest, and the entourage that accompanied the Prince and Princess of Wales, servants, household officers, Catherine's Spanish ladies, Arthur's council staff, moved through a landscape that must have seemed, to Catherine at least, entirely unlike anything she had experienced before. Spain, in December, retains something of the light and warmth of the south. England, in December, has a particular quality of cold greyness, of bare trees and heavy skies and fields that seem to be waiting rather than sleeping, that can feel very foreign to eyes accustomed to Mediterranean landscapes. Ludlow Castle greeted them as it always had, imposing, ancient, perched above the River Teme with the permanence of stone and history. It was the place Arthur had known best since early childhood. For Catherine, it was entirely new. They settled into their life there as best they could. As was the custom of the age, the prince and princess maintained separate chambers. Privacy, in the modern sense, was not a concept the medieval and early modern world would have recognized, but the tradition of distinct household spaces for husband and wife was observed even in a newly married couple's establishment. Each had their own attendants, their own routines, their own portion of the great castle's life. The great hall would have been the social heart of the establishment, the place where the household gathered for meals, where entertainment was provided on feast days, where the business of the prince's council was conducted in the formal communal manner of the age. Catherine's world at Ludlow was shaped by the Spanish ladies who had come with her from home, Doña Elvira Manuel and her household, the familiar presences that connected her to the life she had left behind. But she was also, gently and gradually, beginning to find her place in the English world that surrounded her. One relationship that seems to have been particularly significant was her connection with Lady Margaret Pole. Margaret Pole was the wife of Sir Richard Pole, a key member of Arthur's household, and she was a woman of extraordinary royal lineage, a niece of Edward IV, which made her a cousin of Queen Elizabeth. She was also the daughter of George, Duke of Clarence, the brother of the two Yorkist kings who had been drowned, according to legend, in a butt of Malmsey wine. Margaret Pole carried within her veins the blood of the old Plantagenet royal house, and she wore that inheritance with a quiet, dignified authority. She and Catherine formed a friendship at Ludlow, a genuine connection between two women of intelligence and character who found in each other something worth holding on to in the cold castle at the edge of England. The friendship between Catherine and Margaret Pole would prove enduring. It would outlast Arthur's death, outlast Catherine's long years of waiting and uncertainty, and persist through the tumultuous decades that followed. Margaret Pole became one of Catherine's most loyal and trusted companions, a relationship that had its roots in these quiet months at Ludlow, when they were both finding their way in difficult circumstances. Arthur, meanwhile, resumed his duties as head of the Council of Wales and the Marches. This was not merely ceremonial. The council conducted real business, administering justice, overseeing governance, hearing disputes, maintaining the royal presence in a borderland that had historically required firm and consistent attention. Arthur attended the Maundy Thursday ceremonies, presided over council meetings, continued the work of learning governance that had been his preparation since childhood. He was, in these months, fulfilling exactly the role his father had designed for him. The Welsh Marches themselves were a fascinating and sometimes challenging administrative environment. This borderland between England and Wales had its own particular character, shaped by centuries of conflict and uneasy coexistence between English and Welsh, by the legacy of the great Marcher lordships that had governed it during the medieval period, and by the specific challenges of administering a region that did not quite belong entirely to either of the cultures that met within it. Arthur's council served as the primary instrument of royal authority in this complex territory, and the work of maintaining that authority required both the ceremonial presence of the prince and the practical expertise of the experienced administrators around him. There are small traces of the couple's life at Ludlow that suggest something more personal beneath the formality. Arthur had written those careful Latin letters to Catherine in the years before their marriage, formal, correct, but letters nonetheless, evidence of a kind of sustained attention. At Ludlow, they were living in the same building, sharing the same routines of household and governance, beginning the ordinary daily texture of a shared life. How much time they spent together in anything resembling ease and privacy is impossible to say. The world of Tudor royalty was not a world that easily accommodated ordinary intimacy, but they were, by all evidence, two young people of intelligence and education, both shaped by the same tradition of Renaissance learning, both capable of the kind of Latin conversation that was the common intellectual currency of the age. Catherine spoke Spanish and Latin. Arthur spoke English, French, and Latin. In that shared language, somewhere in the middle of the winter that was slowly, imperceptibly turning toward spring, they would have had conversations. We do not know what they said to each other. We do not know whether they laughed together, or what they feared, or what they hoped for the years stretching ahead. The winter moved forward. The days grew short, and then, gradually, began to lengthen again as February gave way to March. Spring, that most anticipated of English seasons, began to announce itself in the countryside around the castle, and then, at the end of March, both Arthur and Catherine became ill. The nature of the illness that struck them both in those final days of March 1502 has been debated by historians and medical specialists ever since. The most popular contemporary explanation was the sweating sickness, the mysterious and terrifying disease that had accompanied Henry VII's French mercenaries into England in 1485 and had struck the country in periodic epidemics ever since. The sweating sickness was, by contemporary accounts, a disease of extraordinary violence and speed. Its victims were overtaken by a cold sweat, followed by intense heat, a racing pulse, headache, and extreme weakness. Its course was rapid. Most cases resolved one way or another within 24 hours. Survive the first day, the folk wisdom had it, and you would likely live. The sweating sickness had a grim democratic quality that set it apart from many other diseases of the age, where plague tended to find its most lethal expression among the poor, whose crowded living conditions, inadequate nutrition, and limited access to care made them most vulnerable. The sweating sickness struck with apparent impartiality across all social classes. The young and the physically robust were as likely to succumb as the elderly and the frail. Wealthy, well-fed, carefully tended individuals died of it as readily as their servants and tenants. This indiscriminate quality made it particularly frightening to the aristocratic and royal classes, who were accustomed to thinking that their resources and conditions of life gave them some protection against the diseases that ravaged the lower orders. But Arthur's decline was not rapid in that way. He became ill at the end of March. He did not die until the 2nd of April, nearly a week of suffering. This timeline sits uneasily with a straightforward case of sweating sickness, which the historian Kara Cornelius Kramer has noted, would typically have resolved far more quickly. The Tudor physicians who attended Arthur were evidently puzzled themselves. They could not clearly identify what was killing the prince, and their uncertainty is preserved in the vague language of the contemporary accounts. The physicians who attended Arthur at Ludlow were doing their best within the framework of medical knowledge available to them, a framework that was genuinely beginning to change, in the spirit of the Renaissance that was reshaping every area of intellectual life, but that still depended heavily on the ancient theories of humoral medicine inherited from the Greeks. The body, in this understanding, was governed by 4 humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and illness was the result of an imbalance among them. Treatment involved attempts to restore balance, bleeding, purging, administering herbs and compounds designed to promote the flow of the humour that was deficient or to reduce the one that was excessive. These treatments could sometimes help. They could also, in cases where the underlying disease required rest and nutrition rather than further physiological stress, make things worse. There was also the simple reality of Ludlow's physical environment. The castle was cold. The Welsh winters were damp. Arthur had spent years in that climate, and whatever constitutional vulnerability he carried with him, whether from his premature birth, or from some inherited tendency, or simply from the accumulated wear of years of hard study and dutiful performance, the conditions at Ludlow were not those most conducive to recovery from a serious illness. Catherine, who survived the same illness, had grown up in the warmth of southern Spain. Whether that environmental difference contributed to the divergent outcomes is one of the questions that medicine, then or now, cannot definitively answer. Other theories have been advanced over the years. Tuberculosis, the great killer of the age, then called consumption, fits some aspects of Arthur's decline, particularly the suggestion in some sources that he had not been entirely robust in the months following the wedding. Pneumonia, possibly brought on by the damp cold of the castle, influenza, diabetes. The scholar Kara Kramer has advanced the intriguing theory of atypical cystic fibrosis, a genetic condition that can present with symptoms overlapping several of the diseases mentioned in the contemporary accounts, and which might explain both Arthur's slow decline and certain other patterns in Tudor family health. if Arthur did carry such a genetic variant, he might have obtained it from one or both of his parents, and the same variant, or a related one, might help to explain the extraordinary number of failed pregnancies that would later characterize both Elizabeth of York and Catherine of Aragon herself. None of these theories can be definitively confirmed or ruled out. The honest answer, the only honest answer, is that we do not know what killed Arthur Tudor. The physicians of the age did not know either. They watched him weaken day by day, and there was nothing they could do. Catherine was ill as well during this period. She was desperately sick, sick enough that her own survival was genuinely in doubt for some time. The fact that she recovered, and Arthur did not, has sometimes been taken as evidence against sweating sickness, on the grounds that the disease tended to be equally severe to all it touched, and sometimes more lethal to the strong than the weak. But Catherine had grown up in the Mediterranean climate of southern Spain, while Arthur had spent his formative years in the cold, damp climate of the Welsh borders, and constitutions shaped by different environments respond differently to the same illness. Whatever the explanation, Catherine survived, and Arthur did not. The household at Ludlow would have been, in those final days, a place of increasing dread. The atmosphere in the great rooms of the castle, the hall, the chapel, the council chamber, must have taken on the particular quality that large households acquire when someone important within them is dying, and everyone knows it, but cannot say it aloud. The servants would have gone about their duties more quietly than usual. The council would have suspended its ordinary business. The chaplains would have been in attendance, saying prayers, offering what spiritual comfort they could to a young man, who was, by any measure, too young to be in this situation. Catherine, in her own chambers, was herself still gravely ill. Whether she knew how serious Arthur's condition was, whether the two of them were able to have any communication in those final days, whether there were messages passed between chambers, or whether the illness and the protocols of a noble household in crisis kept them entirely apart, we do not know. The sources are silent on the precise human texture of those last days. What we know is that they were in the same castle, both sick, and that one recovered and one did not. The physicians attending Arthur, perhaps including members of the council's own medical staff, perhaps physicians brought from further afield once it became clear that the prince was not recovering, would have been doing everything their training and their knowledge permitted. They would have taken his pulse. They would have examined his urine. They would have consulted the humoral framework that organized all their understanding of what illness was and how it operated. They would have administered remedies, herbs, compound medicines, perhaps bleeding, perhaps the gentle foods and broths that were prescribed for patients too weak for ordinary diet. And they would have watched, with growing helplessness, as none of it made a difference, the precise moment of Arthur's death, the exact hour of the morning or afternoon of the 2nd of April on which he breathed his last, is not recorded in any document that survives. He died on that day, and that is what history has preserved. The room where he died was presumably his own chamber in the castle, the space where he had slept through the years of his residence at Ludlow, attended by his personal servants. Whether he was conscious at the end, whether he spoke any words that his attendants preserved, whether he died quietly or in distress, all of that is lost. What his household did know in the hours immediately following his death was that everything had changed. The Prince of Wales was dead. The heir to the throne of England was gone. The man who had been their lord and their master and the centre of their institutional world had ceased to exist. The practical demands of the situation, the sealing of the rooms, the sending of messengers, the beginning of the elaborate process of preparing for a royal funeral, would have needed to begin immediately. But beneath all of that practical activity, in the ordinary human beings who had served Arthur through his years at Ludlow, there was simply grief. On the 2nd of April, 1502, Arthur Tudor, Prince of Wales, died at Ludlow Castle. He was 15 years old. He had been married for 4.5 months. He had been Prince of Wales for 12 years. He had been the great hope of his dynasty since before he drew his first breath. He was gone. The silence that followed in that castle, the silence of a household in which the person around whom everything was organized had suddenly ceased to exist, must have been absolute. The servants who had attended the prince through all his years at Ludlow, the councillors who had watched him grow from a 7-year-old boy into a 15-year-old husband, the Spanish ladies who had accompanied Catherine from Granada, who were now in a foreign country with their mistress, a widow at 16, Lady Margaret Pole, whose friendship with Catherine had taken root so recently and was now the most important human connection Catherine had in England. All of them, in that first hour after Arthur's death, moving through a world that had just shifted on its foundations, not yet knowing what would come next. The news of Arthur's death left Ludlow on the 2nd of April, carried by messengers riding hard toward the south, toward London, toward the court that was gathered at Greenwich Palace on the south bank of the Thames. The news arrived at Greenwich on what the sources variously record as the 4th or 5th of April. The precise day matters less than the weight of what the messengers carried with them. The road from Ludlow to London was a long one, and the messengers who rode it with this news must have felt the burden of what they carried pressing upon them with every mile. This was not news that anyone would be glad to deliver. This was the end of everything Henry VII had been building toward for 15 years. The royal court at Greenwich was, on ordinary days, a bustling and colourful place, the administrative centre of a kingdom, the social world of the most powerful people in England, the setting in which politics and ceremony and personal ambition intersected in the complex choreography of royal life. The news from Ludlow would have spread through it with a speed that matched the gravity of the event. People fell silent. The normal business of the court suspended itself. Everyone waited. Henry VII was in his private apartments when word came. By the custom of the court, news of such gravity was delivered first to those in the king's immediate circle, who then had the responsibility and the difficulty of carrying it to the monarch himself. On this occasion, the task fell to Henry's confessor, his personal priest, a man accustomed to dealing with matters of the soul and its burdens. The confessor broke the news as gently as the facts permitted. The account of what followed was preserved by contemporaries and has been handed down through the centuries. Henry VII, upon understanding what had happened, upon grasping the full weight of what the messenger's words meant for everything he had built and everything he had hoped, broke down. The controlled, cautious, reserved man who had kept England's throne through 14 years of careful management wept without restraint. He sent for his wife. Elizabeth of York came to her husband. She found him in the depths of grief, weeping, shaken, undone in a way that this most guarded of men rarely allowed himself to be in any public or semi-public setting. And she did what she had always done in the long years of their partnership. She steadied him. A contemporary account preserves something of what she said. She reminded him of God's grace in giving him the throne in the first place, that God, by his grace, had ever preserved Henry himself, and that he should first, after God, remember the good of his own noble person and the comfort of his realm. She reminded him of the children they still had, their son Henry, their daughters Margaret and Mary, and of the simple human fact that they were young enough to have more. She told him that she herself would take the same painful sorrow, that they would bear it together, as they had borne everything else together through the years of struggle and establishment. Henry thanked her for her words. He took comfort from them, or tried to. Elizabeth returned to her own apartments. There, alone with her women, away from the husband she had just steadied, she broke down in grief of her own, the grief she had kept hidden in order to be what he needed her to be, the grief of a mother for a firstborn son, a grief that had no political utility, and therefore she had not displayed where it might be seen. She wept, according to the accounts, in the deepest grief. It is one of the most human moments in Tudor history. This woman going from her husband's chambers, where she had been strength and comfort and the voice of measured reason, to her own rooms, where she could finally be what she actually was, a mother who had lost her child. The Queen, who could hold a king together, could not hold herself together when there was no one watching who needed her to. She wept alone, and that weeping was perhaps more true than anything else recorded of that terrible day. Elizabeth of York died the following year, on the 11th of February, 1503, in childbirth. The child, a daughter, dying with her. She was 37 years old. It has been speculated by some historians that the grief of Arthur's death had weakened her constitution in ways that made the subsequent pregnancy more dangerous than it might otherwise have been. Whether or not that is true, the loss of his wife within a year of his son's death left Henry VII a diminished man, not broken, not incapable, but changed in ways that were perceptible to those who watched him closely. The calculating intelligence was still there, the political skill remained, but something warmer had gone out of the world for him, and his last years on the throne were marked by a bleakness that the first years had not shown. A prayer service for Arthur's soul was held on the 8th of April. The formal process of preparing the prince's body for burial began. On the 23rd of April, Arthur's coffin was carried from Ludlow Castle to the parish church of the town, a solemn procession through streets that would have been lined with the ordinary people of Ludlow, the merchants and craftsmen and farmers who had lived in the shadow of the castle all their lives, and who now watched the young prince who had been their lord carried out through the gates for the last time. The journey from Ludlow to Worcester, where Arthur was to be buried, was made through weather that seemed almost deliberately to mirror the mood of the occasion. Torrential rain, the kind of driving downpour that turns English roads to mud and the landscape to a grey, sodden blur. The funeral cortege moved through it steadily, the body of the young prince borne through the wet English countryside toward its resting place. The journey took several days. Along the route, the communities through which the procession passed would have come out to witness it, another of the ordinary people's encounters with royal death, the moments when the great world of the court touched the small world of the town and the village. Precisely 3 weeks after Arthur's death, on the 25th of April, 1502, he was buried at Worcester Cathedral. The funeral was a ceremony of considerable grandeur. Henry VII spent the equivalent of £892 on it, a very substantial sum for the age, and the elaborateness of the arrangements reflected both the genuine grief of the court and the political necessity of marking the death of an heir with appropriate solemnity. A royal herald, William Colborne, wrote a detailed first-hand account of the proceedings that has survived, giving us a vivid picture of the ceremony in its full processional weight. The great procession to the cathedral was led by the heralds carrying their rods of office. The coffin was covered in black velvet, embroidered with a great white cross, and decorated with the royal arms and the heraldic emblems of Arthur's various dignities. It was accompanied by torch-bearers who lit the grey April morning with their flames, and by mourners in black robes representing every significant institution and household that the prince had been connected with in his brief life. Inside the cathedral, the arrangements were elaborate and precise. The hearse, the great funerary structure around which the ceremonies were conducted, had been specially constructed for the occasion, draped in black and gold and hung with escutcheons and banners of the prince's arms. Hundreds of candles burned around it. The combined atmosphere of incense and candlelight and the cold, ancient stone of the medieval building would have been overwhelming in its solemnity. One of the most striking details preserved in Colborne's account is the moment when a knight on horseback, Sir Griffith ap Rhys, bearing Arthur's armour and weapons, rode the full length of the cathedral to the choir, and there dismounted before the presiding bishop. The horse was offered at the altar, along with Arthur's sword and shield, in a gesture that combined the rituals of Christian burial with the older, martial traditions of chivalric honour. Arthur had never ridden in battle. He had never lifted a sword in anything other than practice or ceremony. Yet here, in the great dim cathedral of Worcester, the martial symbols of what he might have become were laid down before God's altar in his name. At the end of the ceremony, Arthur's household servants and gentlemen ushers broke their white staves of office over their heads and cast the broken pieces into the grave, the final symbolic severing of the bond between servant and master, the formal ending of a service that death had already ended. It was a gesture ancient in its origins and profoundly human in its feeling, the breaking of the staff, the physical expression of an irreversible change, the world of the household acknowledging, in the most concrete way available to it, that the person it had served was gone. It was, by any measure, a noble burial. It was the burial of a prince who had been genuinely mourned. None of Arthur's immediate family was present. Catherine was still too ill to travel. She was only beginning to emerge from the worst of the illness that had struck them both, and the journey to Worcester was beyond her. Henry VII and Elizabeth of York absented themselves as well, citing the customary reluctance of monarchs to be present at the ceremonies of death, and also, there is a grimmer note in some accounts, the fact that Worcester was at that time believed to be suffering from an outbreak of plague. The great funeral, with all its elaborate ceremony, was attended by representatives and officials rather than by the king and queen who had lost their son, or the wife who had lost her husband. There is something quietly devastating about this detail. The most significant funeral that Tudor England had yet staged, the burial of the dynasty's eldest son and heir, was a performance witnessed by delegates, rather than by the people who actually loved and missed the young man being buried. It was, in its way, a perfect emblem of the royal life, the most personal moments of loss enacted in public, surrounded by protocol and ceremony, the human grief submerged beneath the institutional requirements of dynasty and dignity, the elaborate coffin, the hundreds of candles, the knight in armour riding the length of a great cathedral, all of it witnessed by no one who had sat with Arthur through a long evening, no one who had tutored him in Latin, no one who had walked with him through the castle grounds at Ludlow, no one who had laughed with him, argued with him, known him as himself, rather than as the Prince of Wales. The Chantry Chapel that stands at Worcester Cathedral today, Prince Arthur's Chantry, an elaborate two-storey structure of stone decorated with Tudor emblems and carved figures, was built approximately 2 years after the burial, around 1504. It was designed to be a place where prayers could be said in perpetuity for Arthur's soul. The masses and intercessions that medieval Catholic theology held to be of benefit to the dead in their passage through purgatory. It was, in its way, a magnificent monument to loss, to the prince who had been meant to change everything, and had instead been taken before he could begin. The Chantry stands to this day. Visitors to Worcester Cathedral can stand before it and look up at the carvings, the pomegranates of Catherine of Aragon, the Tudor roses, the royal arms, and think about what they mark. A boy of 15, a marriage of 4 months, a question that shook a church and a kingdom, a name that became in its absence one of the great what-ifs of English history. Catherine of Aragon, now the Dowager Princess of Wales, returned to London as she recovered from her illness. She had gone to Ludlow a princess preparing to govern. She came back a widow at 16, in a country that was not her own, waiting to learn what her future would hold. The journey from Ludlow back to London was itself a difficult one. A young woman, recently recovered from a serious illness, travelling the long roads back from the Welsh borders, carrying the weight of her widowhood and the uncertainty of her position. She moved through a country that was simultaneously mourning the prince she had been married to, and beginning, quietly, to calculate what came next. The political machine of the Tudor court did not stop for grief. Henry VII, even in his sorrow, was already thinking about what Arthur's death meant for England's relationship with Spain, and what might be done to preserve the alliance that had taken so many years to build. Catherine arrived in London and was housed initially in Durham House on the Strand, a large and reasonably comfortable establishment that was appropriate to her rank as Dowager Princess of Wales, though the question of how it was to be maintained and at whose expense would become a source of considerable friction in the years ahead. Her situation was, in the most practical terms, profoundly uncertain. She was a princess of Spain who had been sent to England to be the wife of the Prince of Wales. That prince was dead. She was not yet the wife of the next Prince of Wales. She was not a queen. She was not a royal daughter living in her parents' court. She occupied a peculiar and uncomfortable middle ground, a woman whose status was defined by a marriage that had ended before it had properly begun, in a country where she was a guest rather than a subject, dependent on the goodwill of a grieving and increasingly erratic father-in-law. Her future proved, at first, to be uncertain in ways that would have been humiliating for a princess of her lineage. Henry VII, grief-stricken but never losing his eye for political advantage, moved quickly to preserve the alliance with Spain that Arthur's marriage had represented. Within a year of Arthur's death, he had arranged a new betrothal, this time between Catherine and his surviving son, the now heir, Henry, Duke of York. The young Henry was 11 years old at the time of this betrothal, in 1503. Catherine was 17. There was nothing unusual in the age difference, or in the idea of a widow marrying her deceased husband's brother. Canon law had provisions for such marriages, and the practice was not uncommon in the world of dynastic politics. What was required was a papal dispensation, acknowledging the impediment of the relationship and granting permission for the union nonetheless. The dispensation was sought. Ferdinand and Isabella wrote letters attesting that Catherine and Arthur's marriage had never been consummated, that Catherine had come to the proposed second marriage as a virgin, and therefore the impediment was of the lesser kind rather than the greater. The Pope granted the dispensation. The betrothal proceeded. And then things became complicated. Henry VII, by 1503, was a man changed by grief. Elizabeth of York had died in February of that year, dying in childbirth, as so many women of the age did, the child she carried dying with her, and the loss of his wife seems to have affected the king in ways that went beyond ordinary political calculation. He became increasingly erratic in his handling of the Catherine question. At various points, he entertained the idea of marrying her himself. At other points, he allowed the negotiations with Spain over her dowry to stall, leaving Catherine in a kind of limbo, neither fully released to return to Spain, nor yet married to the young Henry. In circumstances that grew increasingly financially difficult, the pension she was supposed to receive from the English crown was not reliably paid. She was reduced in some periods to poverty that was genuinely uncomfortable for a woman of her rank, dependent on the charity of her father-in-law, who was simultaneously holding her in England as a diplomatic asset. The Spanish ladies who had accompanied Catherine from Granada, those faithful companions who had crossed the Bay of Biscay with her and shared the exhausting journey through England and the cold months at Ludlow, were in an equally difficult situation. They had no incomes of their own. They depended on Catherine, who depended on Henry VII, who had chosen, for reasons that were partly financial and partly political, and partly simply the expression of an increasingly withdrawn and suspicious old age, to leave the matter unresolved. Some of Catherine's ladies grew desperate enough to attempt to find husbands among the English nobility, with varying degrees of success. Others remained loyal to their mistress through years of waiting, sharing her straitened circumstances with a devotion that says something very moving about both the character of the women and the bond that had formed between them in the shared experience of Ludlow and its aftermath. Ferdinand, for his part, was not above using his daughter as a bargaining chip in his own negotiations with Henry VII. Catherine spent the years between 1502 and 1509 in this painful suspended state, a princess without a clear role, a widow without an obvious future, a woman whose fate was being decided by men on both sides of the Channel who had their own interests to serve. She bore it with a patience that probably contained more anguish than the historical record shows. She had been trained since infancy for a particular kind of life, the life of a queen, a ruler's wife, a diplomatic symbol made flesh, and the years of waiting and uncertainty were a kind of exile from everything she had been prepared to be. She learned English during these years, receiving instruction and practicing the language with a diligence that reflected her understanding that England was likely to be her permanent home, whatever else happened. She deepened her faith, spending long hours in prayer and religious observance, finding in her devotion the sustaining center that the instability of her practical circumstances could not provide. She wrote letters to her father, to her confessor, to Henry VII, that are models of composed diplomatic language concealing the strain of her actual situation. She also maintained, through all these years, the claim that would become one of the most consequential assertions in English history. She was a virgin. She had been a virgin when Arthur died. Whatever people might say, whatever boasts might be reported, whatever legal arguments might be constructed on the basis of proxy testimony and courtly gossip, the truth was the truth, and she knew what it was. Catherine of Aragon possessed, among all her qualities, a particular kind of inner certainty, a bedrock of self-knowledge and religious conviction that made her genuinely unmovable on the questions that mattered most to her. The years of difficulty, of financial hardship and political uncertainty did not shake this. If anything, they seemed to have reinforced it. She became, in her quiet, enduring way, more English in some respects than Spanish. The country that had been her exile was becoming, gradually, her home. She formed English friendships. She developed English tastes. She remained Spanish in her faith and in the deepest currents of her character. But the England she inhabited during these difficult years was not entirely alien to her. She understood it in its people and its politics, and its particular flavour of religious life, better perhaps than most people born to it. In April 1509, Henry VII died. The throne passed to his surviving son, who was proclaimed King Henry VIII. He was 17 years old, brilliant, physically imposing, educated to an unusual degree for a king of his time, and he had inherited the Tudor crown, rather than being raised from birth to bear it, which made him, in some ways, a different kind of king than Arthur might have been. One of Henry VIII's first acts as king was to marry Catherine of Aragon. The marriage took place on the 11th of June, 1509, 6 weeks after his accession. Catherine was 23, Henry was 17. They were married at the Franciscan Church in Greenwich, in a ceremony quiet compared to the great spectacle of Arthur and Catherine's 1501 wedding. but no less significant for that. England had its queen. The Spanish alliance was renewed, and Catherine, after 8 years of uncertainty and difficult waiting, had the role she had always been meant to have. To understand what that moment must have meant to Catherine requires us to understand what those 8 years had actually been. She had arrived in England at 15 as a celebrated princess, surrounded by ceremony and warmth. She had been, for 5 brief months, the Princess of Wales, living at Ludlow, beginning the life she had been prepared for. Then Arthur had died, and everything had changed. The years that followed had been years of disappointment, financial difficulty, political manipulation, and the particular humiliation of a woman whose worth was calculated entirely in terms of the dowry her father would or would not pay. She had been used as a bargaining counter in negotiations she had no power to influence. She had watched the young Henry grow from an 11-year-old boy she was betrothed to into a 17-year-old king who chose to marry her, and that choice, freely made rather than merely inherited, must have meant something to her. The marriage lasted 18 years. It was, in its early decades, apparently a good one. Henry VIII was devoted to Catherine, proud of her intelligence and dignity, and she bore the duties of queenship with the calm authority she had cultivated since childhood. She served as regent of England while Henry was on campaign in France in 1513. A real political role, carried out with real ability. When the Scots invaded England in Henry's absence, it was Catherine who managed the response, who wrote to Henry of the victory at Flodden Field with a pride and capability that reflected the full stature of the woman she had become. She was, in those years, everything that her upbringing had prepared her to be. She gave him a daughter, the Princess Mary, who would later become Queen Mary of England. She did not give him the son he needed, and as the years passed and the sons Catherine bore either died in infancy or were stillborn, the king's need for a male heir became an obsession that overshadowed everything else. 5 children who did not survive, 1 daughter who did, and Henry, growing older and more anxious about the succession, beginning to look for explanations that would give him permission to start again. It was in the late 1520s that Henry VIII began to look for a way out of his marriage. He had fallen deeply in love with Anne Boleyn, a lady of the court, and he wanted to marry her. He needed an annulment, a declaration that his marriage to Catherine had never been valid in the first place, and he needed a theological justification for that annulment. He found his justification, or thought he did, in the long-ago question of Arthur and Catherine's marriage. His lawyers argued that Catherine's first marriage to Arthur had been properly consummated. If that was true, then Henry's marriage to her was prohibited by the law of God. For the book of Leviticus, read by Henry's theologians in a particular way, stated that a man should not take his brother's wife. If Arthur had truly known Catherine as a husband, then Henry's marriage to her was not merely legally irregular, but spiritually forbidden. The Pope's dispensation had been obtained, Henry's lawyers argued, on false pretenses. Catherine had told the Pope the marriage was unconsummated, but the evidence suggested otherwise. The evidence? What was the evidence? There was Arthur's morning after boast, reported by his gentleman, and now brought into the light of public record 30 years after the fact. There were witnesses called to testify, including the Earl of Shrewsbury, who said that since he had consummated his own marriage at 15, he naturally assumed Arthur had done the same. But this was not first-hand knowledge. This was one man's assumption based on his own experience, a form of testimony that would strike any modern court as worthless. There was not direct evidence. There was not a single witness who could say, with first-hand knowledge, that they had seen or heard anything that definitively proved the consummation had taken place. There was, on the other side, Catherine's absolute and unwavering testimony, maintained under circumstances of extraordinary difficulty, to the effect that the marriage had never been consummated. And Catherine, when she appeared before the Legatine Court in 1529, the ecclesiastical court assembled to hear Henry's case, did so in person, unbidden, against all expectation. She was not supposed to come. She was a woman, a queen, and the conventions of the age suggested she would conduct her defence through representatives. Instead, she appeared herself, knelt before the king, her husband, the man she still regarded as her lawful husband, and addressed him directly and without apparent fear. She told the assembled court that she had come to England as a virgin, that Arthur had never known her as a wife, that she was telling the truth, as she had always told the truth, and that she called upon God to witness the sincerity of her statement. And then she walked out of the court and refused to return. It was one of the most extraordinary acts of personal courage in Tudor history. Catherine of Aragon was not a reckless woman, not a woman given to dramatic gestures. She was, by all accounts, measured, dignified, deeply devout, and acutely aware of the political dimensions of everything she did. Her appearance before the Legatine Court, her statement, her refusal to participate further, these were not the actions of a woman who had lost control of herself. They were the actions of a woman who had calculated exactly what she was willing to fight for and had decided that this was the place to make her stand. She appealed to her nephew, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, who was the most powerful monarch in Europe, and whose own authority over the Pope put the Vatican in an impossible position. Catherine was not simply a wronged wife fighting a domestic battle. She was a princess of Spain, the niece of the most powerful ruler in Christendom, and her cause was his cause by the bonds of blood and dynasty. The Pope, Clement VII, was caught between the demands of the English king on one hand and the pressure of the emperor on the other, and in that impossible position could not bring himself to grant Henry what he wanted. The legal proceedings dragged on for years. Henry's frustration mounted. Anne Boleyn waited. The court manoeuvred and speculated. And in England, the question of a marriage that had lasted 4.5 months in a cold Welsh castle 30 years before was slowly, inexorably reshaping the relationship between a king, a church, and a nation. The English Reformation, the break from Rome, the dissolution of the monasteries, the religious upheaval that would mark English life for generations, had its origins in many places and many factors. It was not simply, or only, about Henry VIII's desire to annul his marriage to Catherine. The broader currents of the Reformation that was already reshaping Europe, the particular character of English theological tradition, the financial incentives that the dissolution of the monasteries offered to a crown always in need of revenue, all of these played their part. But at the human centre of the English Reformation, at the specific turning point where things changed, was the figure of Catherine of Aragon, refusing to accept an annulment based on the claim that a long-dead teenager had consummated a marriage of 5 months in a Welsh castle. And at the centre of that claim was Arthur, the prince who was not there to speak for himself, the boy who had made a morning-after boast that may or may not have reflected reality, the forgotten prince whose absence from history had already changed everything, and whose memory was now being used to change everything again. Henry VIII got his annulment, eventually, from his own ecclesiastical courts, operating under his own authority as supreme head of the Church of England. He married Anne Boleyn. He pursued 6 wives in total before his death in 1547. The Church of England took the place of the Church of Rome as the institutional home of English Christianity. The monasteries were dissolved. The art and architecture and accumulated heritage of centuries of Catholic religious life were swept away with a thoroughness that still shapes the English landscape today. Catherine of Aragon died on the 7th of January, 1536, at Kimbolton Castle. having been stripped of her title and her position, and refusing to the last to acknowledge herself as anything other than Henry's true and lawful wife. She was 50 years old. She had never wavered from the account of her first marriage that she had given consistently for more than 3 decades. To the end, she signed her letters as Catherine the Queen, and she died as she had lived, with a composure and a certainty that her contemporaries, even those who disagreed with her, found difficult not to admire. The English historians who came after were left with the question that cannot be answered. What if Arthur had lived? It is the most tantalizing of counterfactual questions in all of English history. If Arthur had survived the illness that struck him in March 1502, if he had recovered as Catherine recovered and gone on to rule, there would have been no Henry VIII as king, no 6 wives, no English Reformation, no break with Rome, no dissolution of the monasteries, no Mary I, no Elizabeth I, no Edward VI. The entire subsequent history of England, and by extension of much of the English-speaking world, pivots on that single April morning in Ludlow Castle. What kind of king would Arthur have been? The evidence of his character suggests someone quite different from his younger brother. Where Henry VIII was flamboyant, impulsive, capable of great charm and great cruelty, Arthur seems to have been measured, studious, careful in the manner of a child raised from the very beginning to understand the weight of responsibility. David Starkey's exaggerated sense of responsibility of the eldest child. That phrase suggests a young man who would have brought to the throne a deliberateness, a caution, perhaps a wisdom that his circumstances had forced upon him young. He might have been, some historians have speculated, more like his father than his brother, a king who prioritized stability over glory, who favored diplomacy over warfare, who built the institutions of royal power quietly rather than dramatically. Whether that would have made him a great king or simply a competent one, history cannot tell us. He was not given the chance. He was, in the end, a 15-year-old boy who died in a cold Welsh castle in the early weeks of an English spring. His name, chosen before his birth to conjure the legend of Camelot, became instead the name of the prince who was not, who represented a road not taken, a future that never came to pass, a golden age that existed only in his father's imagination. Prince Arthur's Chantry at Worcester Cathedral is, by any measure, a remarkable piece of architecture. It was completed around 1504, 2 years after Arthur's burial, and it represents the grief and the ambition of a dynasty expressed in stone and carved decoration. The Chantry is a 2-story structure, an unusual design that has the effect of somewhat overshadowing the medieval tombs that surround it, as though the Tudors wanted to make absolutely certain that no one could look into that part of the cathedral without being drawn to Arthur's monument. Its decoration is elaborate and distinctly Tudor in character. Royal arms, Tudor roses, the pomegranate emblems of Catherine of Aragon, those last a poignant detail, the symbol of the wife who survived him woven permanently into the monument of the husband who did not. The lower portion of the Chantry contains the tomb itself. The upper portion was designed as a chapel, where priests could say masses for the repose of Arthur's soul. The theological tradition of the time holding that prayers and masses offered on behalf of the dead could ease their passage through purgatory and hasten their arrival in heaven. It was not an unusual arrangement for a royal or noble burial of the period, but for the heir to the throne of England, it was executed with a grandeur that matched the magnitude of the loss it marked. The pomegranates on Arthur's Chantry are worth pausing over. Catherine of Aragon's personal emblem, chosen, perhaps, for the pomegranate's associations with fertility and also with the Granada that had formed such a central part of her parents' great triumph, the reconquest of Spain, followed her through her entire life. It appears on her belongings, her decorations, the architectural details of the buildings associated with her, and it appears here, on the monument of her first husband, as though the brief months of their marriage at Ludlow had permanently entwined their emblems, whatever the subsequent complications of her history. To stand before the Chantry today is to be in the presence of something that refuses to be simply historical. Arthur's life was short, his documented achievements were modest. A promising education, a politically significant marriage, a few months of governance at Ludlow. He wrote careful Latin letters and presided over a council in a border castle, and died before he was 16. By any conventional measure of historical significance, he does not rank with the great figures of Tudor England. And yet, the question of what would have happened if he had lived, that question does not go away. It attaches itself to every visit to the Chantry, to every reading of the documents that survive from his brief life, to every consideration of the English Reformation and the break with Rome and all that followed from it. The weight of the unlived life presses against the cold stone, and the visitor who stands in the silence of Worcester Cathedral can't entirely escape the feeling of standing at a hinge point, a place where history turned and turned on such a fragile contingent thing as the health of a 15-year-old boy in a damp Welsh castle. Henry VII survived his son by 7 years, dying in April 1509 after a reign of 23 years. He never entirely recovered from the grief of Arthur's death, compounded as it was by the death of Elizabeth of York the following year. The careful, calculating man who had built the Tudor dynasty from the wreckage of the Wars of the Roses closed his eyes for the last time in his private chamber at Richmond Palace, having done what he set out to do, established a dynasty, secured a succession, left England more stable than he had found it, but having also seen the particular hope he had given himself a name for die in a Welsh springtime before it had fully bloomed. Henry V, who inherited the throne and the challenge of continuing what his father had built, went on to become one of the most written about monarchs in English history. The shadow of his brother's unrealized potential hung over him in ways that are difficult to entirely measure. He was raised after Arthur's death to be a prince, but he had not been raised from birth to be an heir in the way that Arthur had. He was educated to an unusual degree for a king of his time, capable of writing theology and playing music and engaging scholars on their own terms. But the particular, deliberate, dutiful formation that had shaped Arthur was not his. He became a different kind of king, and England became, in consequence, a different kind of country. The story of Arthur Tudor is, in one sense, a story of absence, of the things that did not happen, of the king who was not crowned, the reign that was not lived, the England that never came to be. It is a ghost story of sorts, not frightening, but haunting in the way that all the paths not taken are haunting when we pause to look down them. What England would have looked like under a King Arthur III, the long-promised golden age finally made real, is a question historians and readers have wondered about across the centuries since his death. The evidence of his character suggests someone quite different from his younger brother. Where Henry VII was flamboyant, impulsive, capable of great charm and great cruelty, Arthur seems to have been measured, studious, careful in the manner of a child raised from the very beginning to understand the weight of responsibility. David Starkey's exaggerated sense of responsibility of the eldest child, that phrase, suggests a young man who would have brought to the throne a deliberateness, a caution, perhaps a wisdom that his circumstances had forced upon him young. He might have been, some historians have speculated, more like his father than his brother, a king who prioritized stability over glory, who favored diplomacy over warfare, who built the institutions of royal power quietly rather than dramatically. Henry VII had avoided the expensive military adventures that would later characterize Henry VIII's reign. He understood that war cost money, and money was one of the foundations of a secure dynasty. Arthur, shaped by his father's careful instruction and his own cautious temperament, might have continued in that vein. England in the first half of the 16th century, under a King Arthur, might have been a country of quiet consolidation rather than dramatic upheaval. Whether there would have been an English Reformation at all is perhaps the most momentous of the questions Arthur's death raises. The Reformation in England was not, as we have seen, purely a matter of Henry VIII's marital ambitions. There were theological and political currents that had been building for decades, and England was not immune to the Protestant ideas that were reshaping European Christianity in the early 16th century. But the specific English form of the Reformation, the break with Rome, the declaration of royal supremacy over the Church, the dissolution of the monasteries, was inseparable from the story of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon and the Great Matter. If Arthur had lived, there would have been no Great Matter. There would have been no need for Henry VIII to seek an annulment from Catherine, because Catherine would have been Arthur's wife, not his. Henry would have been, at most, a younger royal brother with some important position in the church or the administration of the kingdom, but not its king. The religious history of England, and by extension of the English-speaking world, would have been entirely different. Whether that would have been better or worse for England and for the world is a question without a definitive answer. The English Reformation, for all its violence and disruption, also produced some remarkable things. The English Bible, the liturgical tradition of the Book of Common Prayer, the particular flavour of English religious sensibility that shaped literature and thought and political culture for centuries. Whether a Catholic England under King Arthur would have developed its own distinctive forms of genius, or would have followed a different path entirely toward different achievements, is one of the great speculative exercises of historical imagination. What we can say is that the England that actually came to be, the England of the Reformation, of Elizabeth I and the Elizabethan Age, of Shakespeare and the King James Bible, and the gradual development of parliamentary government, was shaped, at its foundation, by Arthur's absence as surely as by anyone's presence. He was the king who was not, and in that not being, he shaped everything. But we should not let the enormous scale of Arthur's historical significance, the what-ifs, the counterfactuals, the vast reshaping of the world that his death set in motion, distract us from the simpler, more human truth of his story. Arthur Tudor was, before anything else, a boy who was carried into a great cathedral at 4 days old and given a name that carried the weight of an entire civilization's mythology. A boy who was sent away from his family at 7 years old to learn the business of kingship in a cold Welsh castle. A boy who wrote careful Latin letters to a girl he had never met, year after year, through his childhood and adolescence. A boy who stood in white satin in the grandest cathedral in England at 15 and exchanged vows with a princess who had crossed storms to reach him. A boy who was ill in the spring of 1502, in a castle above the River Tame, while the world outside was just beginning to wake from winter. A boy who died, and in the centuries since, that death has been weighed against everything it prevented and everything it enabled and everything that came after. His name appears in the histories as a footnote to his brother's story, or as the originating point of Catherine of Aragon's tragedy, or as the counterfactual at the heart of the Reformation debate. He is remembered for his death more than his life, for what he represented rather than what he was, for the question he left unanswered more than anything he managed to say. This seems unfair to Arthur, not because history is obligated to be fair. It is not, and he would have understood that better than most. but because the life, such as it was, deserves to be seen clearly before the enormous shadow of its consequences falls across it. He was a gentle person in a world that did not ask for gentleness from its princes. He was studious and responsible in ways that his father required, but that must also have reflected, at some level, his own character, because you cannot fake that kind of quiet diligence across 15 years of observation. He was kind to his tutors, apparently. He was loyal to the household that surrounded him at Ludlow. He formed a genuine connection in some form with the Spanish princess who became his wife. Not perhaps the grand romance of legend, but something real and human. Two young people finding their way toward each other across the enormous formal distances of their world. Think for a moment about what his daily life had actually been in those Ludlow years. He rose before dawn on winter mornings when the Welsh hills would have been invisible in the grey mist beyond the castle walls. He walked through cold stone corridors to chapel for the morning office, the chanting of prayers that marked the beginning of every day according to the rhythms of the Catholic liturgical calendar. He sat at a desk full of books and manuscripts, working through his Latin under the patient guidance of Bernard André or Thomas Linacre, constructing sentences with the care of a craftsman who understood that the language he was mastering would be the instrument of his authority for the rest of his life. He attended council meetings where men twice and 3 times his age discussed the governance of a borderland that was nominally his responsibility, and he watched and listened and learned, slowly, patiently, accumulating the knowledge of how power actually worked in practice rather than in theory. In the evenings, there would have been the ordinary life of a noble household. Music, perhaps, conversation with the gentlemen of his chamber, the simple physical relief of food and warmth after a long day of study and administration. He would have had particular favourites among the members of his household, men whose company he found more congenial than others, men he trusted in the way that reserved people reserve their trust, cautiously, once given, firmly held. We do not know their names or what was said between them in the quieter hours of the castle's day. We know only that they were there, those unnamed companions of his everyday life, and that when Arthur died, they broke their white staves of office over their heads at the door of his Worcester Cathedral funeral. That gesture, the breaking of the staves, was one of the most personal moments of the entire ceremony. The elaborate rituals, the knight on horseback, the hundreds of candles, the grieving nobility in their black robes, all of that was the public language of royal death, the vocabulary of dynasty and dignity that the occasion demanded. But the men who broke their staves had served Arthur not as a symbol, but as a person. They had attended him through the cold winters and the brief, warm summers of Ludlow, through the council meetings and the chapel services and the long evenings in the great hall. Their grief, encoded in that ancient ritual gesture, was the grief of people who had known him, and they were expressing it in the only language available to them. The formal language of service ended and loss acknowledged, before turning away from the grave and walking back into a world where the prince was no longer present. His tutors remembered him with genuine affection and admiration. Bernard André, the blind French poet who had spent years teaching him, wrote of him with unmistakable pride. He had been, André suggested, not merely a diligent student, but a genuinely gifted one, a young man who had absorbed the classical curriculum with an ease and depth that exceeded what his age and obligations might have suggested were possible. Thomas Linacre, who had shaped the education of some of the greatest minds of the generation, had given his best teaching to this boy in a castle on the Welsh border and found the investment worthwhile. Catherine of Aragon remembered him too, in her way, across all the years of difficulty that followed his death, through the 8 years of uncertain widowhood and the 18 years of her marriage to Henry VIII and the terrible final years of dispossession and isolation. The pomegranates on his chantry at Worcester are her emblem, permanently entwined with his, as if the months at Ludlow had created a bond that even death and the extraordinary complications of everything that followed could not entirely undo. She never denied that she had been Arthur's wife. She denied only what she had always denied, that the marriage had been consummated. That distinction mattered enormously to her, for reasons both religious and personal, but in maintaining it, she also maintained the reality of what Arthur had been to her. Her first husband, the young man she had come to England to marry, the prince with the careful Latin letters and the white satin wedding clothes and the cold castle at the end of a winter's journey. He deserved more time. That is the simplest and the most honest thing that can be said about him. He deserved the years at Ludlow to turn into a reign. He deserved the careful Latin and the archery and the dancing and the council meetings to amount to something more than preparation for a future that was taken away. He deserved to watch his children grow up, to grow old in the company of the auburn-haired princess who had crossed the Bay of Biscay to be his wife, to become at last the king, whose name his father had borrowed from the oldest legend of the land and made real. He deserved, in short, the ordinary span of a human life, the decades that most people take entirely for granted, the long middle passage of experience and growth and change that transforms a promising beginning into something that can be evaluated on its own terms, rather than only in terms of what it might have been. He did not get those years. History turned on a damp April morning in a Welsh castle, and the world moved in a different direction entirely. And yet, one of the quietly remarkable things about Arthur Tudor's story is the extent to which the world did not simply forget him. His death changed everything, and the enormity of what it changed has had the paradoxical effect of keeping him in memory, even if the memory is most often of his absence rather than his presence. Every discussion of the English Reformation circles back eventually to the marriage that preceded it, and to the question of what happened or did not happen between two 15-year-olds in a bridal chamber in 1501. Every biography of Henry VIII acknowledges the elder brother who would have been king. Every study of Catherine of Aragon begins with the prince she married first. Arthur is, in a strange and slightly melancholy way, omnipresent in Tudor history, always there as a reference point, always defining the shape of what came after by the shape of what he left undone. His father built him a chantry. His wife kept his emblem on the monument above his grave. His tutors wrote of him with pride. The people of Worcester have maintained the memory of his burial in their cathedral across 5 centuries. The visitors who come to stand before his chantry today, looking up at the carved pomegranates and the Tudor roses in the cool light of the medieval nave, are doing something that people have been doing continuously since 1504, marking the presence of a life that ended, attending to the reality of a person who was here and is gone. That continuity of attention is its own form of tribute. Arthur Tudor did not get to be King of England. He did not get to rule or govern or go to war or make the choices that define a reign. He did not get to grow old. He got 15 years. 15 years of careful preparation, of solitary study, of watching from the margins while the great events of his father's court unfolded around him, of writing Latin letters to a girl he had never met, of 5 bright months at Ludlow in the aftermath of the grandest wedding England had seen in living memory, 15 years of being the future, without ever getting to become the present. And then he got a cold morning in April, and the world that had built itself around his existence had to find a way to continue without him. We tell his story tonight as we have told it here, because the life that is too brief to evaluate on its own terms is still a life, still a person, still a presence, still a set of qualities and habits and particular ways of being in the world that existed and mattered and left an impression on the people who knew them. Arthur was not a great king. He was not a great general or a great statesman or a great lover. He was a 15-year-old boy who tried to be the best version of what his father had asked him to be in the limited time that was given to him, in the cold rooms of a Welsh castle at the edge of the Tudor world. That deserves to be remembered. What remains then is the chantry, the carved stone, the pomegranates, the faint possibility, on certain quiet days when the light falls at a particular angle in Worcester Cathedral, of feeling the presence of something that ended too soon, not dramatically, not on a battlefield, not in the great symbolic gestures of a remembered life, but quietly, in a Welsh castle, in the first weeks of spring. The River Thames still runs below the rocks where Ludlow Castle stands. The Welsh hills are still there, still grey and green through the mist of October mornings and the sharp cold of December. The world Arthur knew, the physical world of stone and river and hill and sky, persists, and somewhere in it, if we are willing to be still and listen, the quiet, careful, dutiful, brief life of Arthur Tudor persists too. And what remains too is this story, told tonight gently, so that someone drifting toward sleep can carry a little of it into the quiet. This life, so brief and so carefully lived, that left such a long shadow on the world that came after. Arthur, Prince of Wales, the king who never was, and yet here he is remembered. And that, perhaps, is the only kind of immortality that any of us, princes or otherwise, can reasonably hope for. And so ends the story of Arthur Tudor, Prince of Wales, a life that lasted only 15 years, and yet whose echoes have never quite fallen silent. A boy born in Winchester to the sound of bonfires, named for a legend, prepared with extraordinary care for a future that dissolved on an April morning in the rain of the Welsh marches. He was the promise of the Tudor dynasty in its most hopeful, most innocent form. Before the complications, before the break with Rome, before the great upheavals that would define the century that his death helped to set in motion. He was, in the phrase that history cannot quite let go of, the king who never was. But he was also, before any of that, simply Arthur, a boy who read his Latin carefully and loved his archery, and wrote formal letters to a girl he had never met, and stood in white satin on a November morning, beside a princess who had crossed storms to reach him. A boy who tried, in the short time he was given, to be exactly what he had been shaped to be. May he rest in the quiet of Worcester Cathedral, in the peace his brief and careful life deserved. Good night, dear listener. Good night. If this story has stayed with you, if some part of Arthur's brief and careful life has lingered as you drift towards sleep, we would be glad to know. A gentle like, a quiet comment about what moved you most, helps keep these stories coming to you through the nights. And to all of you, old friends and new, welcome home. Rest well. We will be here when you wake.